Preface. We are entering upon a subject which I confess is in itself harsh and exotic, very improper for our tongue, yet I doubt not but they will pardon this, who shall consider that other philosophies and sciences have been lately well received by several nations translated into their own languages, and that this, as being the first, contributes not a little to the understanding of the rest. Another disadvantage this subject incurs far more considerable. There is not anything more difficult to be retrieved out of the ruins of antiquity than the learning of the Eastern nations, and particularly that of the Chaldaeans. What remains of it is chiefly transmitted to us by the Greeks, of whom some converted it to their own use, intermixing it with their philosophy, as Pythagoras and Plato. Others treated expressly of it, but their writings are lost. Of its first authors nothing remains. What others took from it is not distinguishable from their proper philosophy. The Greeks were first made acquainted with it by Zoroasters, and long after, by Belus, the former living in the time of Xerxes, the other under Ptolemaios Philadelphus. Whence it may be inferred that the discourse which Democritus writ of Chaldea, and his commentary of the sacred letters at Babylon, either came short of these sciences, or were so obscure that they conduced little to their discovery. Neither seems the treatise, entitled Magicum, ascribed by some to Aristotle, by others to Rodon, but indeed written by Antisthenes, to have considered the learning and sciences, so much as the history of the professors. Of which kind were also the writers concerning the Magi, cited, under that general title, by Diogenes Laertius. But there wanted not those who further explained to the Greeks what Zoroasters and Belus had first communicated. Hermippus wrote most diligently of magic, and commented upon the verses of Zoroaster. About the time of Antonius Pius flourished the two Julians, father and son, Chaldaick philosophers. The first wrote concerning the Chaldaic rites, the later, theurgic oracles in verse, and other secrets of that science. Afterwards, wrote Symbulus and Pallas concerning the Magi, and the later Platonic philosophers more frequently, Aemilius, 40 books of confutation, Porphyrius, 4. On the history of Julian the Chaldaean, E.M. Bleckus, 28. In Tichuld, of the most perfect Chaldaic theology, and Syrianus, 10. Upon the oracles. Of all these, there is nothing extant, unless the few oracles, dispersed among the Platonic writers, be part of those, which were, by the Greeks translated out of the Chaldaic. Some of these Pletho and Psellus have explained with a comment, adding 2 brief obscure summaries of the Chaldaic doctrine, which we have endeavored to supply and clear, by adding and digesting the few remains of those sciences which lie dispersed amongst other authors, taking care to reject such as are supposititious, or of no credit, as in the historical part, Annius Viterbiensis, Clemens Romanus and the like, in the philosophical, the rabbinical inventions, which manifestly appear to have been of later invention. The history of the Chaldaic philosophy, the first book of the Chaldaeans. Philosophy is generally acknowledged even by the most learned of the Grecians themselves, to have had its original in the East. None of the Eastern nations for antiquity of learning stood in competition with the Chaldaeans and Egyptians. The Egyptians pretended that the Chaldaeans were a colony of them, and had all their learning and institutions from them. But they who are less interested, and unprejudiced judges of this controversy, assert that the Magi were more ancient than the Egyptians, that astrological learning passed from the Chaldaeans to the Egyptians, and from them to the Grecians, and, in a word, that the Chaldaeans were antiquissimum doctorum genus, the most ancient of teachers. Chaldea is a part of Babylonia in Asia, the inhabitants termed Kasdim from Chus, the son of Cham. But the philosophy of the Chaldaeans exceeded the bounds of their country, and diffused itself into Persia and Arabia that border upon it, for which reason the learning of the Chaldaeans, Persians and Arabians is comprehended under the general title of Chaldaic. Of the Chaldaean philosophers. Chapter 1. The Antiquity of the Chaldaic Learning. The antiquity of the Chaldaic learning, though such as other nations cannot equal, comes far short of that to which they did pretend. When Alexander, by his victories against Darius, was possessed of Babylon, Aristotle, a curious promoter of arts, requested his nephew, Callisthenes, who accompanied Alexander in the expedition, to inform him of what antiquity the learning of the Chaldaeans might with reason be esteemed. The Chaldaeans themselves pretended that from the time they had first begun to observe the stars until this expedition of Alexander into Asia were 470,000 years. But far beneath this number were the observations which Callisthenes sent to Aristotle, being out of 1903 years, preserved to that time, which, from the 4,383rd year of the Julian period upward, falls upon the 2,480th. And even this may with good reason be questioned, for there is not anything extant in the Chaldaic astrology more ancient than the era of Nabonassar, which began but on the 3967th of the Julian period. By this era they compute their astronomical observations, of which if there had been any more ancient, Ptolemy would not have omitted them. The first of these is in the first year of Merodach, which was about the 27th of Nabonassar. The next was in the 28th of Nabonassar D. The third observation is in the 127th of Nabonassar, which is the 5th year of Nabopolassar. This indeed is beyond all exception, for we have them confirmed by the authority of Ptolemy, who shews the reasons and rules for the observations. What is more, even this seems to have been only hypothetical. And if we shall imagine a canicular cycle which consists of 1,461 years to have been supposed by Porphyrius to make up his hypothesis, then there will want but 18 years of this number. Chapter 2. That there were several Zoroasters. The invention of arts among the Chaldaeans is generally ascribed to Zoroaster. The name Zoroaster Diogenes Laertius, cited by Laertius, interprets as Zeto Omega Sigma as Sigma Tau Omega Nu, rendered by his translators, a worshipper of the stars. Athanasius Kircher finds fault with this etymology, as being compounded out of two several languages, from the Greek zo and the Chaldee zor, and therefore endeavors to deduce it from tsura, a figure, or tsayar, to fashion, and as and stir, hidden fire, as if it were Zoroaster, fashioning images of hidden fire, or Zoroaster, the image of secret things, with which the Persian Zareph agreeth. But it hath been observed that Esther in the Persian language signifieth a star. The former particle zor, Samuel Bocart derives from the Hebrew shur, to contemplate, and thereupon, for zeto omega sigma sigma tau omega nu, Diogenes Laertius reads theorites asteron, a contemplator of the stars. But we find zor used amongst other words in the name Zorobabel, which we interpret, born at Babylon. Zoroaster therefore properly signifies the son of the stars. The same name it is which some call Zabratas, others Nazazatas, others Zares, others Zaran, others Zaratas, others Zaratas, all which are but several corruptions from the Chaldee or Persian word which the Greeks most generally render Zoroaster. That there were several Zoroasters none deny, but in reckoning them up, there is no small disagreement amongst writers, grounded chiefly upon Arnobius, whom they differently interpret. His words being these: Age nunc veniat quist super ignem zona magus intrita orb Zoroastris, hermipoit essentium uroctori, Bactrianus et illa contrita, cujus, certas res geste historiarum exponit in primis. Arminius, Hostain's nephew and Pamphilius heirs familiar. Francis Patricius, Gabriel Naude, Athanasius Kircher, and others, conceive that Arnobius here mentions 4 Zoroasters, the first a Chaldean, the second a Bactrian, the third a Pamphilian, the fourth an Armenian son of Hostainsdat P. Salmasius alters the text thus: Age nunc veniat queso per ignem zona magus intercere ab orb Zoroastris hermipo ut essentiam oroctori, Bactrianus. Et il conveniat, cujus cesius res gestas historiarum exponit in primo, Armenius, Hostinus Nepos, and familiaris Pamphilus Syri, which words thus altered by himself, imply, as he pretends, but 3 Zoroasters, the first, according to some, an Ethiopian, but, according to Hermippus, a Bactrian. The second, Arminius, nephew of Hostains, of whose actions Ctesias gives account in the first book of his histories. The third named Pamphilus, friend to Cyrus. Key. Vossius, from the same reading of the words, infers that Arnobius mentions only 2, that he manifestly explodes the Bactrian Zoroaster, of Hermippus, and that Ctesias, confuting the fabulous relation of Eudoxus, proved Zoroaster to have lived in the time of Cyrus. But the words of Arnobius seem not to require such alteration, which will appear more, if we mention particularly all those on whom the name of Zoroaster was conferred. The first a Chaldaean, the same whom Suidas calls the Assyrian, adding that he died by fire from heaven, to which story perhaps v. Arnobius alludes, or to that other relation mentioned by John Chrysostom, that Zoroaster the Persian came to the people out of a fiery mountain, or else, by fiery zone, he means the seat of the zoned deities just above the empyreal or corporeal heaven, according to the doctrine of the Chaldaeans, for I find not anywhere that Zoroaster was esteemed an Ethiopian or of interior Libya as Salmasius expounds. Concerning this Zoroaster Arnobius cites Hermippus, who, as Pliny saith, wrote in explication of his verses, and added tables to his volumes. The second, a Bactrian, Justin mentions Zoroastrus king of Bactria contemporary, with Ninus the Assyrian. by whom he was subdued and slain, adding, "He was said to be the first that invented magical arts, and observed the beginnings of the world and the motions of the stars." Arnobius saith, he contested with Ninus, not only by steel and strength, but likewise by the magical and abstruse disciplines of the Chaldaeans. The actions of this Zoroaster, Tasius recorded in the first book of his Persica, for soa Arnobius, Bactrianus and illa conveniat, cujus caesias res gestas historiarum exponit in primo. B. Photius shows the first 6 books of that work treated only of the Assyrian history and passages that preceded the Persian affairs, whereupon I cannot assent to the conjecture of Salmasius, who applies the citation of Ctesias to the nephew of Hostanes, since Hostanes lived under Darius. Bute Diodorus names the king of Bactria whom Ninus conquered, Oxyartes, and some old manuscripts of Justin say Oxyartes, others, Zoroastes. Perhaps the nearness of the names and times gave occasion to some to confound one them, and to ascribe to the Bactrian what was proper to the Chaldaean one, since it cannot be imagined that the Bactrian was inventor of those arts, in which the Chaldean, who lived contemporary with him, was so well skilled. Alekhmanus, a Persian writer, affirms the Arabians and Persians to hold that Zoroaster was not king of the Bactrians, but a magus or prophet, who, by the Persians having wrought upon their king, first introduced a new form of superstition amongst them, whereof there are some remains at this day. The third a Persian, so termed by Laertius and others, the same whom styles a Mede, Suidas, a Perso-Mede, institutor of the Magi, and introducer of the Chaldaic sciences amongst the Persians. Some confound this Zoroaster with the Chaldean, and both of them with Cham the son of Noah, not without a very great anachronism, for we find the word Persian nowhere mentioned before the prophet Ezekiel, neither did it come to be of note till the time of Cyrus. The occasion of which mistake seems to have been for that Zoroaster the Persian is by Pliny, Laertius, and others, styled institutor of magic, and of the Magi, which is to be understood no otherwise than that he first introduced them into Persia. For Plutarch acknowledgeth, Zoroaster instituted Magi amongst the Chaldaeans, in imitation of whom the Persians had theirs also, and the Arabic history. That Zoroaster did not first institute, but reformed, the religion of the Persians and Magi, being divided into many sects. The fourth a Pamphylian, commonly called Er, or Eris Armenius. That he also had the name of Zoroaster, Clemens witnesseth, the same author in the 10. Of his Politics, mentioneth Eris Armenius, by descent a Pamphylian, who is Zoroaster. Now this Zoroaster writes thus, this wrote, I, Zoroaster Armenius, by descent a Pamphylian, dying in war, and being in Hades, I learned of the gods. This Zoroaster Plato affirmeth to have been raised again to life, after he had been dead 10 days, and laid on the funeral pyre, repeated by Valerius Maximus and Macrobius. To this Zoroaster, doubtless the latter part of Arnobius's words, with which interpreters are so much perplexed, ought to be referred, Armenius Hostius Nepos, and Familiaris Pamphylius Syri. Some conjecture he mentions 2 Zoroasters I rather conceive. The words relate only to this one, and perhaps are corrupt, thus, to be restored and distinguished, Armenius Hostius Nepos and Familiaris, Pamphylius Eris, Armenius nephew and disciple of Hostius, Eris Pamphylius. The fifth a Proconnesian, mentioned by Pliny, such as our more diligent place another Zoroaster, a Proconnesian, a little before Hostius. This Zoroaster might probably be Aristeas the Proconnesian, who, according to Suidas, lived in the time of Cyrus and Croesus. He adds, that his soul could go out of his body, and return as often amongst the Chaldaeans, but concerning the time in which he lived, there is a vast disagreement amongst authors. Some of these err so largely as not to need any confutation, such are Eudoxus, and the author of the treatise entitled Magicon, commonly ascribed to Aristotle, who asserts he lived 5,000 years before Plato. Such likewise are Hermippus, Himodorus the Platonic, Plutarch, and Gemistus Pletho, who place him 5,000 years before the destruction of Troy. Others conceive Zoroaster to be the same with Cham, the son of Noah, of which opinion were Didymus of Alexandria, Agathias, Scholasticus, and Abinephes. Cham was the son of Noah. He first taught the worshipping of idols, and first introduced magical arts into the world. His name is Zoroaster, he the second Adris, a perpetual fire. Hither also some refer the rabbinical stories concerning Cham, that by magic he emasculated his father and see, that Noah being by this means disabled from getting a fourth son, cursed the fourth son of Cham, that this curse implied strange service, viz. idolatry, that hereupon the posterity of Cheus became idolaters, Cham himself being the first that made idols and introduced strange service into the world, and taught his family the worshipping of fire. The greater part of writers place him later, Epiphanius in the time of Nimrod, with whom agree the observations said to be sent by Callisthenes to Aristotle of 1903. Years before Alexander's taking Babylon, for from the minyan year of the Julian period in which Babylon was taken, the 1903, upward falls on the 2480. Of the same era, about which time Nimrod laid the foundations of that city, and there settled his empire. Suidas relates him contemporary with Ninus king of Assyria, Eusebius, with Semiramis wife of Ninus. Ninus is placed by chronologers above the 3447 of the Julian period. Suidas reckons him to have lived 500 years before the taking of Troy, Xanthus, 600 years before Xerxes' expedition into Greece. Troy, according to the Marmor Arundelianum, was taken 434 years before the first Olympiad. Xerxes' expedition was on the first of the 75 Olympiad, viz. the Julian period. The account of Suidas therefore falls on the 3030, that of Xanthus on the 3634 of the Julian period. The latest of these seemeth to me most historical, and agreeable to truth. Of his birth, life, and death, there is little to be found, and even that uncertain, whether applicable to him or to the Persian. Plato styles Zoroaster the son of Oromases. But Oromases was a name given to God by Zoroaster the Persian and his followers, whence I conceive that Plato is to be understood of the Persian Zoroaster, who perhaps in regard of his ordinary knowledge, was either allegorically styled, or fabulously reported to be the son of God, or of some good genius, as Pythagoras, Plato, and many other excellent persons were. H. Pliny reports that Zoroaster laughed the same day he was born, and that his brain did beat so hard that it heaved up the hand laid upon it, a presage of his future science, and that he lived in the deserts 20 years upon cheese so tempered as that it became not old. The Assyrian Zoroaster prayed he might die by fire from heaven, and advised the Assyrians to preserve his ashes, assuring that as long as they kept them, their kingdom should never fail. But Cedrenus attributes the same to the Persian. Of writings attributed to him are mentioned verses, 2 millions, upon which Hermippus wrote a comment and added tables to them. Oracles, perhaps part of the foresaid verses. Upon these Syrianus wrote a comment in 12 books. Of agriculture, or mechanics, Pliny allegeth a rule for sowing, and the author of the Geoponics, many experiments under his name, but this was either spurious or written by some other Zoroaster. Revelations, superstitious also, forged by some Gnostics. To these add K, cited by the Arabians, a treatise of magic, and another, of dreams and their interpretation, cited by Jalaldin frequently, inventions doubtless of latter times. Some ascribe the treatises of the Persian Zoroaster to the Chaldaeans, but of those hereafter. Chapter 4th of Belus, another reputed inventor of sciences amongst the Chaldaeans. Some there are who ascribe the invention of astronomy to Belus, of which name there were two persons, one a Tyrian, the other an Assyrian, who reigned in Babylonia next after. The Arabians, about the 2682nd year of the world, according to the account of Africanus, for whose inventions the Babylonians honored him as a god. There is yet standing the temple of Jupiter Belus, he was the inventor of the science of the stars, and B. Diodorus, speaking of the Egyptians, they affirm that afterwards many colonies went out of Egypt, and were dispersed over the earth, and that Belus, reputed to be son of Neptune, and Libya, carried one to Babylon, and making choice of the river Euphrates to settle it, instituted priests after the manner of those in Egypt exempt from all public charges and duties, which the Babylonians call Chaldaeans. These observed the stars, imitating the Egyptian priests, naturalists, and astrologers. Thus, Diodorus. But that Belus was son of Neptune in Libya, is nothing but Greek mythology. That he brought a colony out of Egypt into Babylon, is fabulous. For the Egyptians had not any correspondence with foreigners for a long time after. But to confirm that he was skillful in those sciences, Aelian gives this relation. Xerxes son of Darius, breaking up the monument of ancient Belus, found an urn of glass in which his dead body lay in oil, but the urn was not full, it wanted a hand breadth of the top. Next the urn there was a little pillar, on which it was written, that whosoever should open the sepulchre, and did not fill up the urn, should have ill fortune. which Xerxes reading grew afraid, and commanded that they should pour oil into it with all speed, notwithstanding it was not filled. Then he commanded to pour into it the second time, but neither did it increase at all thereby. So that at last failing of success he gave over, and shutting up the monument, departed very sad. Nor did the event foretold by the pillar deceive him, for he led an army of 50 myriads against Greece, where he received a great defeat, and returning home died miserably, being murdered by his own son in the night time abed. To this Belus, Semiramis his daughter erected a temple in the middle of Babylon which was exceeding high, and by the help thereof the Chaldaeans who addicted themselves there to contemplation of the stars, did exactly observe their risings and settings. Chapter 5. Other Chaldaean philosophers. From Zoroaster were derived the Chaldean magi and philosophers his disciples, amongst whom a Pliny mentions one Azonaces, master of Zoroaster, which doubtless must have been meant of some later Zoroaster, there being many of that name, as we shewed formerly. By the same author are mentioned of the ancient Magi Marmaduks a Babylonian and Zamosendus an Assyrian, of whom nothing is left but their names, no monuments extant of them. To these add Zoroastres a Chaldean philosopher who wrote mathematics and physics, and Teucer a Babylonian and ancient author who wrote concerning the deconates. The mathematicians also, saith D. Strabo, mention some of these, as Sidanus, and Naburianus, and Sudinus, and Seleucus of Seleucia a Chaldean, and many other eminent persons. Chapter 6 of Berosus, who first introduced the Chaldaic learning into Greece. After these flourished Berosus, or, as the Greeks call him Berossos, which name some interpret the son of Oseas, for, as is manifest from Elias, Br with the Chaldees is the same with Br, in Syriac, whence Bar Ptolemaeus, as if the son of Ptolemy, Bar Timaeus, and the like. Gorianides and other rabbins call him Bar Hoshea, the Arabians Barasa, Soabenepi, and others. Barthius saith that there are some who assert him contemporary with Moses, which opinion justly he condemns as ridiculous. D. Claudius Verderius, in his censure upon the Annian Berosus, affirms he lived a little before the reign of Alexander the Great. Upon what authority I know not that he lived in the time of Alexander, we find in the oration of Tatian against the Gentiles, but the same Tatian adds, he dedicated his history to that Antiochus, who was the third from Alexander. But neither is this reading unquestionable, for E. Eusebius cites the same place of Tatian thus, Berosus the Babylonian, priest of Belus at Babylon who lived in the time of Alexander, and dedicated to Antiochus, the third after Seleucus, a history of the Chaldaeans in 3 books, and relates the actions of their kings, mentions one of them named Nabuchodonosor, etc. Here we find Muepsilon Tau Seleucon. But in the text of Tatian, Mupsilon Tau Alphau Tauunu after Alexander, and indeed this reading seems most consonant to the story. The next to Alexander was Seleucus Nicator, the next to him, Antiochus Soter, the third, Antiochus Theos, who began his reign 61 years after the death of Alexander. Now it is possible that Berosus at the time of Alexander's taking Babylon might be 30 years old or less, and at his 90th year or somewhat younger might dedicate his history to Antiochus Theos. Or we may say, that by Antiochus III from Alexander is meant Antiochus Soter, reckoning Alexander himself inclusively for one, Seleucus II, Antiochus Soter III, to whom from the death of Alexander are but 44 years. And in approving this account we may retain the reading of Eusebius, supposing the first to be Seleucus, the second Antiochus Soter, the third Antiochus Theos. Neither is this inconsistent with Gesner's translation of the words of Tatian Kappa Alpha Tau Alpha Alam Dexi Alpha Nu Delta Humicranu Gam Epsilon Nu Mu Epsilon Nu Omicrons, as in Stephen's edition of Eusebius, or Kappa Alpha Tau Alpha Alam Dexi Alpha Nu Delta Humicranu Gam Epsilon Gam Omicron Nu Os, as in Tatian himself, Qui Alexandri Itate Vixit, which interpretation Onufrius Panvinius also follows. But considering these words more intently it came into my mind that it might better be rendered, Qui Alexandri Itate Natus Est, whereby all scruple may be taken away, supposing Berosus to have been born but 2 years before Alexander's death, by which account he must have been near 64 years old when Antiochus Theos, to whom he dedicated his book, began to reign, which way soever it is. Berosus published his history in the time of Ptolemaeus Philadelphus, for he reigned 38 years. And in the 6th year of his reign Antiochus Soter began to reign in Syria in the 22nd of Antiochus Theos, to one of whom Antiochus dedicated his book. But by no means can we assent to the learned Cornelius Gossura S.G., who by Alexander conceives to be meant not he who was surnamed the great son of Philip, but that Alexander who succeeded Demetrius Soter in the kingdom of Syria, and was succeeded by Demetrius Nicanor, by Antiochus understanding Antiochus Soter, who reigned next after Demetrius Nicanor. For if it were so, Berosus must have been a whole age later than Manetho, but Manetho flourished under Philadelphus. Philadelphus died in the 3rd year of the 133 R&D Olympiad, but Antiochus Soter invaded Syria in the 1st of the 166th Olympiad. How then could Berosus live so late, who is a little precedent to Manetho, as Scintillus expressly affirms? Again, we may assert the time of Berosus another way. Pliny saith, he gave account of 480 years, which doubtless were years of Nabonassar. Now the era of Nabonassar begun in the 2nd year of the 8th Olympiad, from which, if we reckon 480, it will fall upon the later end of Antiochus Soter's reign, wherefore Berosus dedicated his book either to him or to Antiochus Theos his son. These arguments will not suffer us to doubt of the time of Berosus. This Berosus is mentioned by many of the ancients. G. Vitruvius saith, he first settled in the island Cous and there opened learning. Josephus that he introduced the writings of the Chaldaeans concerning astronomy and philosophy among the Grecians. Pliny that the Athenians for his divine predictions dedicated to him publicly in their gymnasium a statue with a golden tongue. He is mentioned likewise by Tertullian, and the author of the Enchronicon Alexandrinum. He wrote Babyloniacs or Chaldaics in 3 books, for they are cited promiscuously under both these titles. The Babyloniacs of Berosus, Othenaeus cites, but Tatian saith, he wrote the Chaldaic history in 3 books. And Clemens Alexandrinus cites Berosus, his 3rd of Chaldaics, and elsewhere, simply his Chaldaic histories. And Agathias affirms, he wrote the Antiquities of the Assyrians and Medes, for those books contained not only the Assyrian or Chaldaean affairs but also the Median, Cagathias, as somewhere Berosus the Babylonian, and Athenocles, and Symmachus relate, who have recorded the Antiquities of Assyrians and Medes. Out of this work, Josephus hath preserved some excellent fragments, but the supposititious Berosus of Annius is most trivial and foolish, of the same kind as his Megasthenes and Archilochus. Many kings are there reckoned which are nowhere to be found, and scarce is there any of those fragments which Josephus cites out of the true Berosus. On the contrary, some things are plainly repugnant, as when he saith Semiramis built Babylon, whereas Josephus saith Berosus wrote that it was not built by Semiramis. A daughter of this Berosus is mentioned by Shustin Martyr 1, a Babylonian sibyl, who prophesied at Cumae. This cannot be understood of that Cumaean sibyl who lived in the time of Tarquinius Priscus, for betwixt Tarquinius Priscus and the First Pontic War are 245 years, but of some other Cumaean sibyl of much later time. That there were several sibyls who prophesied at Cumae, Onufrius hath already proved out of the treatise of wonderful things ascribed to Aristotle, and out of Marcianus Capella and other writers. Berosus being the person who introduced the Chaldaic learning into Greece. We shall with him close the history of the learned persons or philosophers amongst the Chaldaeans. Book 2nd, The Chaldaic Institution and Sex. Chapter 1. That all professors of learning were more peculiarly termed Chaldaeans. Philosophy or learning was not taught and propagated by the Chaldaeans after the Grecian manner, communicated by public professors indifferently to all sorts of auditors, but restrained to certain families. These were by a more peculiar compilation termed Chaldaeans, addicted themselves wholly to study, had a proper habitation allotted for them, and lived exempt from all public charges and duties. Of these is Diodorus to be understood, who relates that Belus instituted priests exempt from all public charges and duties, whom the Babylonians call Chaldaeans. Strabo adds that there was a peculiar habitation in Babylonia, allotted for the philosophers of that country who were termed Chaldaeans, and that they inhabited a certain tribe of the Chaldaeans, and a portion of Babylonia, adjoining to the Arabians in the Persian Gulf. There were those Chaldaeans who, as Cicero saith, were named not from the art but nation, and of whom he is elsewhere to be understood, when he affirms that in Syria the Chaldaeans excel for knowledge of the stars, and acuteness of wit, and DQ. Curtius, who describing the solemnity of those who went out of Babylon to meet Alexander, saith, then went the Magi after their manner, next whom the Chaldaeans, non vates modo sed artifices Babyloniorum. Where though some interpret artifices, those astrologers who made instruments for the practice of their art, yet Curtius seems to intend no more than the Chaldaeans of both sorts, the plebeian tradesmen and the learned. Of these Chaldaeans peculiarly so termed, is Elaertius likewise to be understood, when he cites as authors of philosophy amongst the Persians the Magi, amongst the Babylonians or Assyrians the Chaldaeans. And Hesychius, who interprets the word Chaldaeans, a kind of Magi that know all things. Chapter 2, their institution. These Chaldaeans preserved their learning within themselves, by a continued tradition from father to son. They learn not after the same fashion as the Greeks, for amongst the Chaldaeans philosophy is delivered by tradition in the family, the son, receiving it from the father, being exempted from all other employment, and thus having their parents for their teachers, they learn all things, fully and abundantly, believing more firmly what is communicated to them, and being brought up in these disciplines from children, they acquire a great habit in astrology as well, because that age is apt to learn. As for that they employ so much time in study. But among the Greeks for the most part they come unprepared, and attain philosophy very late, and having bestowed some time therein, quit it to seek out means for their livelihood, and though some few give themselves up wholly to philosophy, yet they persist in learning only for gain, continually innovating some things in the most considerable doctrines, and never follow those that went before them, whereas the barbarians persevering always in the same, receive each of them firmly. But the Greeks aiming at gain, by this profession erect new sects, and contradicting one another in the most considerable theorems, make their disciples dubious, and their minds, as long as they live, are in suspense and doubt, neither can they firmly believe anything, for if a man examine the chiefest sects of the philosophers, he will find them most different from one another, and directly opposite in the principal assertions. Chapter the third sects of the Chaldaeans distinguished according to their several habitations. As all professors of learning amongst the Chaldaeans were distinguished from the rest of the people by the common denomination of the country, so were they distinguished amongst themselves into sects, denominated from the several parts of the country, wherein they were seated, whereof Pliny the Elder, in Natural History, Book the 6th, Chapter the 26th, and Strabon, in Geography, Book the 16th, page 739, mention Hipparene, from Hipparenus, a city in Mesopotamia. Babylonians, from Babylon, Orcanes from Orco, a city of Chaldea, and Borsippanes, from Borsippe, another city of Babylonia, dedicated to Apollo and Diana. And though Diodorus prefer the Chaldeans before the Grecians for their perseverance in the same doctrines without innovations, yet we must not infer thence that there was an universal consent of doctrine amongst them, but only that each of them was constant in belief and maintenance of his own sect, without introducing any new opinion. For that amongst these sects there was no absolute agreement is manifest from Strabo, who adds that they did assert contrary doctrines, some of them calculated nativities, others disapproved it, whence Lucretius G. The Babylonic doctrine doth oppose the Chaldee, and astrology o'erthrows. Chapter 4th Sects of the Chaldaeans distinguished according to their several sciences. Another distinction of sects amongst the learned Chaldaeans was, according to the several sciences which they profess. The prophet Daniela, relating how Nebuchadnezzar sent for all the learned men to tell him his dream, takes occasion to name the principal of them, which were four: Hartumim, Ashaphim, Makashphim, Chazdim. Hartumim are by Abrahamiel, expounded magi skillful in natural things, and by Jacades, those magi who addicted themselves to contemplative science, which interpretation suits well with the derivation of the word, not as some would have from Charmin, burnt bones, nor from Chayat, a pen or scribe. For the word in Chaldee is not taken in that sense, but from Charad, a Persian word, by transmutation of intush, whether signifying to know, whence Elmatinus, instead of this Perse Chaldee, useth two Arabic words, Alakamahan, Valarafahan, wise and knowing persons. The Hartumim therefore were not magicians, but rather such as studied the nature of all things, under which contemplation is comprehended theology, and physic, the knowledge of beings, divine and natural. Ashaphim, Jacades expounds those magi qui scientiam activum exculabant, so Constantinus renders him, but adds, that Jacades is mistaken, and that the Ashaphim were rather the same as Supimu in Arabic wise religious persons. This indeed is the more probable. Supimu is an attribute, proper to those who delivered all theology, mystically and allegorically, derived from suf, wool, either for that the garments of these professors of theology were made only of wool, never of silk, or from attiring, and veiling the things which concern the love of God, under the figures of visible things, whence is derived the word hasavif, mystic theology, and perhaps, from the Hebrew root asaph, comes the Greek sigme omikronphios, the first attribute given by the Greeks to learned persons, afterwards changed into philosophos. These ashafim, the ordinary interpretation of the text in Daniel, styles astrologers, and Aben Ezra, derives the word from Wantini. Shasha'in, they observe the heavens at that time, but the astrologers are meant afterwards by the word shazdim. The ashafim of the Chaldaeans seem rather to be the same with the magi of the Persians' priests, the professors of religious worship, which they termed magic. Makashfim properly signifieth revealers. The word is derived from kashaf, which the Arabians still use in the same sense of revealing. Makashfim are generally taken for such as practice diabolical arts, not improperly rendered sorcerers. Chazdim was an attribute conferred in a particular sense upon the learned persons of the Chaldeans, amongst whom, by a restriction yet more particular, it signified the professors of astrology, this being a study to which they were more especially addicted, and for which most eminent, these are those Chazdim, whom Strabo styles Kiophilam dadal talphio macroniota as sigmatar humacronio macronmuota kapaos, astronomical Chaldeans. Besides these four kinds, there are several others mentioned, and prohibited by the Levitical law, Deuteronomy 18:10, Shofar, Kazmim, Megnonenim, Menakashim, Hobober, Habur, Shel, Oba, Fidioni, Doresh el Hametim. Rabbi Maimonides, reciting them all, adds that they were several sorts of diviners sprung up of old amongst the Chaldaeans. Jachiides mentions them as particular kinds of the Makashfim. Strabo, Geographica, Book the 16th, page 739. The second part, the Chaldaic doctrine. From the four general kinds of the professors of learning amongst the Chaldaeans mentioned by the prophet Daniel may be inferred, of what parts or sciences the Chaldaic doctrine did consist. The Hartumim were employed in divine and natural speculation, the Ashafim in religious worship and rites, the Makashfim and Chazdim in divination, these by astrology, those by other arts. Which two last, Diodorus, speaking of the learned Chaldaeans, comprehends under the common name of astrologers, the other two, under that of natural philosophers and priests, for he saith, they imitated the Egyptian priests, naturalists, and astrologers. In treating therefore of the Chaldaic doctrine, we shall first lay down their theology and physic, the proper study of the Hartumim, next, their astrology and other arts of divination practiced by the Chazdim and Makashfim, thirdly, their theurgy, and lastly, their gods, which contemplation and rites were peculiar to the Ashafim. Section the first, Theology and Physic. The Chaldaic doctrine in the first place considers all beings, as well divine as natural. The contemplation of the first is theology, of the latter, physic. Zoroaster divided all things into three kinds, the first eternal, the second had a beginning in time, but shall have no end, the third mortal. Of the two first belong to theology. The subject of theology, they divided into four kinds. The first is God, the Father and King. Next him there followeth a multitude of other gods. In the third place they rank daemons, in the fourth heroes, or, according to others, angels, daemons, and souls. The third, or mortal kind, is the subject of physic. It comprehends all things material, which they divide into 7 worlds, 1 imperial, 3 ethereal, 3 corporeal. Chapter 1, of the eternal being, God. The first kind of things is eternal, the supreme God. In the first place they conceive that God the Father and King ought to be ranked. This the Delphian oracle confirms. Chaldeans and Jews wise only, worshipping purely a self-begotten God and King. This is that principle of which the author of the Chaldaic summary saith, they conceive there is one principle of all things, and declares that it is one and good. A God in his body resembles light, in his soul truth. That God is light, besides the testimony of Eusebius, may be inferred from the oracles of Zoroaster, wherein are frequently mentioned Veb light, beams and splendor of the Father. In the same sense they likewise termed God of fire, for in Chaldee signifying both light and fire, they took light and fire promiscuously, by which fire he afterwards professeth to mean the sun, whom he styles the brightest and whitest of things, as if light and fire, brightness and whiteness were all one. This is manifest from the Zoroastrian oracles also, wherein he is sometimes called simply fire, sometimes the paternal fire, the one fire, the first fire above. Upon this ground was the worship of fire instituted by the ancient Chaldaeans, and from them derived to the Persians, of which hereafter, when we shall come to speak of their gods and religious rites. Chapter 2. The emanation of light or fire from God. God, being an intellectual light or fire, did not shut up his own fire within his intellectual power, but communicated it to all creatures first and immediately to the first mind, and to all other eternal and incorporeal beings. The next emanation is the supramundane, light, an incorporeal, infinite, luminous space in which the intellectual beings reside. The supramundane light kindles the first corporeal world, the empyreum, or fiery heaven, which being immediately beneath the incorporeal light, is the highest, brightest, and rarest of bodies. The empyreum diffuseth itself through the ether, which is the next body below it, a fire less refined than the empyreum, but that it is fire, the more condensed parts thereof, the sun and stars, sufficiently evince. From the ether this fire is transmitted to the material or sublunary world, for though the matter whereof it consists be not light but darkness, yet this vitificative fire actuates and gives life to all its parts, insinuating, diffusing itself, and penetrating even to the very center, passing from above to the opposite part, through the center of the earth. We shall describe this more fully when we treat of the particulars. Chapter 3 of things aveternal and incorporeal. The second or middle kind of things is that which is begun in time but is without end. To this belong that multitude of gods, which Eusebius saith they asserted next after God the Father and King, and the souls of men. Celus and the other summarists of the Chaldaic doctrine name them in this order: unintelligibles, intelligibles, and intellectuals. Intellectuals, fountains; hyperarchei or principles; unzoned gods, zoned gods; angels, daemons, souls, all these. Over this middle kind Zoroaster held Mithra to preside, whom the oracles call the mind. Chapter 4, the first order. In the first place are three orders: one intelligible, another intelligible and intellectual, the third intellectual. The first order, which is of intelligibles, seems to be that which is only understood. This is the highest order. The second or middle order is of intelligibles and intellectuals, that is, those which are understood, and understand also, as Zoroaster. There are intelligibles and intellectuals which understanding are understood. The third is of intellectuals, which only understand, as being intellect, either essentially or by participation. By which distinction, we may conceive that the highest order is above intellect, being understood by the middle sort of minds. The middle order participates of the superior, but consists of minds which understand both the superior and themselves also. The last order seems to be of minds, whose office is to understand not only themselves but superiors and inferiors also. Of the first of which orders, the anonymous author of the summary of the Chaldaic doctrine, thus then they worship a certain paternal depth consisting of three triads. Each triad hath a father, a power, and a mind. Celus somewhat more fully. Next the one they assert the paternal depth, completed by three triads, each of the triads having a father first, then a power middle, and a mind the third amongst them, which shutteth up the triad within itself. These they call also intelligibles. This triple triad seems to be the same with the triad mentioned in the oracles of Zoroaster. What Celus terms father, he calls father also. The father perfected all things, and paternal monad where the paternal monad is. The second, which Celus calls power, he terms also the power of the father. Neither did he shut up his own fire in his intellectual power, and the strength of the father. And the duad generated by the monad and resident with him. The monad is enlarged which generates two, and again, the duad resides with him. This is also the first paternal mind. For the third of this triad, which Celus terms the mind, he saith is the second mind. The Father perfected all things, and delivered them over to the second mind, which all mankind calls the first. And as Celus saith, that this mind shuts up the triad and paternal depth within itself, so Zoroaster it is the bound of the paternal depth and fountain of intellectuals. And again, it proceeded not further but remained in the paternal depth. Chapter 5. The second order. Next these there is another order, of intelligibles and intellectuals. This also is divided threefold, into Ginjas, Sinachas, and Tletarchs. With him agrees the anonymous summarist. Then is the intelligible Jinx. Next which are the Sinachis, the imperial, the ethereal, and the material. After the Sinachis are the Tletarchs. The first are Ginjas, of which the oracle, intelligent Ginjas do themselves also understand from the Father, by unspeakable counsels being moved so as to understand. Celus saith, they are certain powers next to the paternal depth consisting of three triads which according to the oracle, understand by the paternal mind, which contains the cause of them singly within itself, Platho. They are intellectual species conceived by the Father, they themselves being conceptive also and exciting conceptions or notions by unspeakable counsels. These seem to be the ideas described by the Zoroastrian oracle. The mind of the Father made a jarring noise, understanding by vigorous counsels omniform ideas, and flying out of one fountain. They sprung forth, for from the Father was the counsel and end. But they were divided, being by intellectual fire distributed into other intellectuals, for the King did set before the multiform world an intellectual incorruptible pattern, the print of whose form he promoted through the world, and accordingly the world was framed, out of which came rushing forth others undistributed, being broken about the bodies of the world which through the vast recesses. In the point of sleepless times of this primigenius idea the first self-budding fountain of the Father budded. Upon which words Proclus, having cited them as an oracle of the gods, adds, hereby the gods declared as well where the subsistence of ideas is, as who that God is who contains the one fountain of them, as also, after what manner the multitude of them proceeded out of this fountain, and how the world was made according to them, and that they are movers of all the systems of the world, and that they are all intellectual initially. Others may find out many other profound things, by searching into these divine notions, but for the present let it suffice us to know that the gods themselves ratify the contemplations of Plato, forasmuch as they term those intellectual causes ideas, and affirm that they gave pattern to the world, and that they are conceptions of the Father, for they remain in the intellections of the Father, and that they go forth to the making of the world, for piomicron lambda epsilon epsilon iota deltais, implies their going forth, and that they are of all forms, as containing the causes of all things divisible, and that from the fountainous ideas there proceeded others, which by several parts framed the world, and are said to be like swarms, because they beget the secondary ideas. Thus Proclus, the second are the synarches, which are three, the imperial, the ethereal, the material, answerable to the several worlds which they govern, for they seem to be minds which, receiving from Hecate the influence of that fire which dispenseth life, infuse it into the imperial, ethereal and material worlds, and support and govern those worlds and give them vital motion. The oracle termeth them anoches. Each world hath intellectual anoches inflexible, where Belus interprets them the most excellent of intelligible species, and of those that are brought down by the immortals into this heaven, in the head of whom is conceived to be a God, the second from the Father. The last of this order are the teletarchs, joined with the synarches by the oracle. The teletarchs are comprehended with the synarches. This second order or triad Proclus and Damascius often mention, styling it by the double name of intelligent and intellectual. Chapter 6. The third order. The last order is of intellectuals. Belus, after the middle order, is the intellectual having one paternal triad, which consists of the once above, and of Hecate and of the twice above, and another which consists of the Amalicti, which are three, and one, the Hypazokos. These are 7 fountains. Anonymous summarist. After these are the fountainous fathers called also cosmogogues, the first of whom is called the once above, next whom is Hecate, then the twice above, next whom 3 Amalicti, and last, the Hypazokos. Of the cosmogogues Belus interprets the Zoroastrian oracle, O how the world hath intellectual guides inflexible, the Chaldaeans, saith he, assert powers in the world, which they term cosmagi, for that they guide the world by provident motions. These powers the oracle calls sustatikoi, as sustaining the whole world. The oracle saith, they are immovable, implying their settled power, sustentive, denoting their guardianship. These powers they design only by the causes and immobility of the worlds. Pletho interprets them the most excellent of intelligible species, and of those that are brought down by immortals in this heaven. The Coryphaeus of whom he conceives to be a god, the second from the Father. The Amalicti also and the Hypazokos are mentioned by the oracle, for from him spring forth all the implacable thunders, and the recesses of the omnilucent strength, of Father-begotten Hecate, and Hypazokos the flower of fire. The Amalicti are powers so termed, for that they are firm and not to be converted towards these inferior things, and also cause that souls be not allured by affections. Chapter the 7th Fountains, and Principles. Besides this last order of intellectuals, which Belus styles 7 fountains, and the anonymous summarist fountain as fathers, the latter gives account of many other fountains. They reverence also a fountainous triad of faith, truth, and love. They likewise assert a principiative son from the solar fountain, and archangel of the beginning, and the fountain of sense, and fountainous judgment, and the fountain of perspectives, and the fountain of characters which walketh on unknown marks. and the fountainous tops of Apollo, Osiris, Hermes, conjunction. They assert material fountains of centers and elements, and a zone of dreams, and a fountainous soul. Next the fountains, saith Belus, are the hyperarchii. The anonymous more fully, next the fountains, they say, are the principalities, for the fountains are more principal than the principles. Both these names of fountains and principles are used by Dionysius Areopagita. Frequently, even in the third triad, he puts the name of principles after whom the archangels. Of the animal productive principles, the top is called Hecate, the middle principiative soul, the bottom principiative virtue. This seems to be that Hecate whom Belus saith, they held to be the fountain of angels, and of daemons, and of souls, and of natures, the same which the oracle means, saying, on the left side of Hecate is the fountain of virtue, for the Chaldaeans esteem Hecate a goddess, seated in the middle rank and possessing, as it were, the center of all the powers. In her right parts they place the fountain of souls, in her left the fountain of goods, or of virtues. Moreover, they say, the fountain of souls is prompt to propagations, but the fountain of virtues continueth within the bounds of its own essence, and is as a virgin incorrupted, which settledness and immobility it receives from the power of the Amalicti, and is girt with a virgin zone. What Belus here calls the fountain of souls, and the fountain of virtues, is the same which the anonymous styles, principiative soul, and principiative virtue. Chapter 8. Unzoned gods, and zoned gods. Next are the Azoni. There are amongst them unzoned Hecates, as the Chaldaick, the Trierotus, Comas, and Ecclesiastic. The unzoned gods are Serapis and Bacchus, and the chain of Osiris and of Apollo. They are called unzoned, for that they use their power freely in the zones, and are enthroned above the conspicuous deities. These conspicuous deities are the heavens and the planets, and whereas he saith, they live in power, enu exiomicronupsilon sigmaia, it is the same attribute which Dionysius gives the third of the second hierarchy, tauonu agamiomeganu exiomicronupsilon sigmaia elphiota. The zoned gods are next. These are they which have particular zones, and are routed freely about the zones of heaven, and have the office of governing the world, for they hold there is a zone kind of deity, which inhabits the parts of the sensible world, and guideth the regions about the material place, according to several distributions. The same office Dionysius seems to assign to the second and third hierarchies. These Azoni, and Zonai, are mentioned also by Damascius. This sendeth out of herself the fountain of all things, and the mountainous chain, but that of particulars, and passeth on to principles and archangels, and Azoni, and Zonai, as the law is of the procession of the renowned particular fountains. And by Proclus, the sacred names of the gods delivered according to their mystical interpretation, as those which are celebrated by the Assyrians. Zonai, and Azoni, and fountains, and Amalisi, and Sinakis, by which they interpret the orders, Zonasioi, of the gods. Chapter 9. Angels and immaterial daemons. Next are the angels. Arnobius saith of Histanes, Belus, that he knew the angels. Ministers and messengers of God did wait on his majesty, and tremble as afraid, at the beck and countenance of the Lord. The Zoroastrian oracles mention reductive angels, which reduce souls to them, drawing them from several things. The next are daemons. Of these the Chaldaeans hold some to be good, others bad. The good, they conceive to be light, the bad, darkness. That there are good daemons, natural reason tells us. Oracle. Nature persuades that there are pure daemons. The burgeons even of ill matter are beneficial and good. Nature, or natural reason, saith Pletho, persuades that the daemons are holy, and that all things proceeding from God, who is good in himself, are beneficial. If the bloomings of ill matter are good, much more are the daemons such, who are in a more excellent rank, as partaking of rational nature, and being mixed with mortal nature. Chapter 10. Souls. Next to daemons, Belus placeth souls, the last of eternal beings. Of forms, the Magi assert three kinds: one wholly separate from matter, the oracle, supercelestial intelligences; another inseparable from matter, having a substance not subsisting by itself, but dependent on matter, together with which matter, which is sometimes dissolved by reason of its nature subject to mutation, this kind of soul is dissolved also, and perisheth. This they hold to be wholly irrational. Betwixt these they place a middle kind, a rational soul, differing from the supercelestial intelligences, for that it always coexists with matter, and from the irrational kind, for that it is not dependent on matter, but on the contrary matter is dependent on it, and it hath a proper substance potentially subsistent by itself. It is also indivisible, as well as the supercelestial intelligences, and performing some works in some manner allied to theirs, being itself also busied in the knowledge and contemplation of beings, even unto the supreme God, and for this reason is incorruptible. This soul is an immaterial and incorporeal fire, exempt from all compounds, and from the material body it is consequently immortal, for nothing material or dark is commixed with her. Neither is she compounded so as that she may be resolved into those things of which she consists. D. This soul hath a self-generate and self-animate essence, for it is not moved by another, for if according to the oracle, it is a portion of the divine fire. And a lucid fire, and paternal notion, is an immaterial and self-subsistent form, for such is every divine nature, and the soul is part thereof. Of humane souls they allege two fountainous causes, the paternal mind, and the fountainous soul. The particular soul, according to them, proceeds from the fountainous, by the will of the Father. Now whereas there are several mansions, one wholly bright, another wholly dark, others betwixt both, partly bright, partly dark. The place beneath the moon is circumambulous, dark on every side, the lunary, partly lucid, and partly dark, one half bright, the other dark. The place above the moon circumlucid, or bright throughout. The soul is seated in the circumlucid region. From thence this kind of soul is often sent down to earth, upon several occasions, either by reason of the flagging of its wings, or in obedience to the will of the Father. This soul is always coexistent with an ethereal body as its vehiculum, which she by continual approximation maketh also immortal. Neither is this her vehiculum inanimate in itself, but is itself animated with the other species of the soul, the irrational, the image of the rational soul adorned with fantasy and sense, which seeth and heareth itself whole through whole, and is furnished with all the senses, and with all the rest of the irrational faculties of the soul. Thus by the principal faculty of this body fantasy, the rational soul is continually joined to such a body, and by such a body sometimes the humane soul is joined with a mortal body, by a certain affinity of nature, the whole being enfolded in the whole enlivening spirity of the embryon, this vehiculum itself being of the nature of a spirit. The image of the soul, viz., that part which being itself void of irrational is joined to the rational part, and depends upon the vehicle thereof, hath a part in the circumlucid region, for the soul never layeth down the vehicle adherent to her k. The soul being sent down from the mansion wholly bright, to serve the mortal body, that is, to operate therein for a certain time, and to animate and adorn it to her power, and being enabled according to her several virtues, do dwell in several zones of the world. If she perform her office well, goes back to the same place, but if not well, she retires to the worst mansions, according to the things she hath done in this life. Thus restore souls to their first condition, according to the measure of their several purifications. In all the regions of the world, some also they conceive to be carried beyond the world. Chapter 11th. The supramundane light. All these eviternal and incorporeal beings are seated in the supramundane light, which itself also is incorporeal, placed immediately above the highest corporeal world, and from thence extending upwards to infinite. Proclus. Abundantly animating light, fire, ether, worlds. Saith, this light is above all the seven worlds, as a monad before or above the triad of the empyreal, ethereal and material worlds. Adding, that this primary light is the image of the paternal depth, and is therefore supramundane, because the paternal depth is supramundane. And again this light, saith he, being the supramundane sun, sends forth fountains of light, and the mystic discourses tell us that its generality is among supramundane things, for there is the solar world, and the universal light, as the Chaldaic oracles assert. And again the centers of the whole world, as one, seem to be fixed in this, for, if the oracles fixed the centers of the material world above itself in the aether, proportionably ascending, we shall affirm that the centers of the highest of the worlds are seated in this light. Is not this first light the image of the paternal depth, and for that reason supramundane also, because that is so? Chapter 12 of Things Temporal and Corporeal. The third and last kind of things, according to Zoroaster, is corruptible or temporal, which as it began in time, so shall it likewise in time be dissolved. The president over these is Arimanes. Under this third kind are comprehended the corporeal worlds, the empyreal immediately below the supramundane light, the ethereal next the empyreal, and the material the lowest of all, as the oracle ranks them. Abundantly animating, light, fire, ether, worlds. These corporeal worlds are seven, oracle. He constituted a heptad of eretic animals. placing the earth in the middle, but the water in the bosom of the earth. The air above these. Belus, explaining how they are 7, saith, they affirm that there are 7 corporeal worlds, 1 imperial and first, then 3 ethereal, and lastly 3 material, the fixed circle, the erratic, and the sublunary region. But this enumeration seems to fall short, for he mentions but 2 ethereal worlds and 1 material. As the learned Patricius observes, who therefore reckons the 7 thus, 1 imperial, 3 ethereal, and 3 elementary. But perhaps it will better suit with the oracle, as also with Belus, to dispose them thus. Corporeal worlds. 7. 1 imperial world, 3 ethereal worlds, the supreme ether, next the imperial, the sphere of fixed stars, the planetary orb, 3 material sublunary worlds, the air, the earth, the water. Neither can it seem strange that the 3 last only should be called material, for the Chaldaeans conceiving matter to be a dark substance, or rather darkness, itself, the imperial and ethereal worlds, which consist only of light or fire, cannot in their sense be said to be material, though corporeal. The imperial or first of these, saith Belus, they attributed to the mind, the ethereal to the soul, the material to nature. Epitome I, by Belus. Chapter 13th. The imperial world. The first of the corporeal worlds is the imperial. It is round in figure, according to the oracle, enclosing heaven in a round figure. Belus. It is also a solid orb, or firmament, for the same oracles call it Sigma Tower Hope Celon Omega Mu Alpha. It consists of fire, whence named the imperial, or, as the oracles, the fiery world, which fire being immediately next the incorporeal supramundane light is the rarest and subtlest of bodies, and by reason of this subtlety penetrates into the ether, which is the next world below it, and, by mediation of the ether, through all the material world. This may be evinced more particularly, saith Proclus, from the divine tradition, for the empyreum penetrates through the ether, and the ether through the material world, and, though all the intellectual tetrads and hebdomads have a fountainous order, and consequently an imperial president, nevertheless they are contained in the worlds, since the imperial passeth through all the worlds. Nevertheless, the empyreum itself is fixed and immovable, as Simplicius, further explicating the Chaldaic doctrine, acknowledgeth by this similitude. Let us imagine to ourselves 2 spheres, one consisting of many bodies, these 2 to be of equal bigness, but place one together with the center, and put the other into it. You will see the whole world existing in place, moved in immovable light, which world according to its whole self is immovable, that it may imitate place, but is moved as to its parts, that herein it may have less than place. Chapter 14th. The ethereal worlds. After the empyreum, the oracle names the ether, fire, ether, worlds, confirmed by Belus and the anonymous summarist, who assert that next the empyreum are the 3 ethereal worlds, but of these 3 they mention only 2, the sphere of fixed stars, and the planetary sphere. The third might be the ether, which is betwixt the empyreum and the sphere of fixed stars. The ether is a fire less subtile than the empyreum, for the empyreum penetrates through the ether, yet is the ether itself so subtile that it penetrates through the material world. The second ethereal world is the sphere of fixed stars, which are the more compacted or condensed parts of the ethereal fire, as Patricius ingeniously interprets this oracle. He compacted a great number of inerratic stars, forcing fire to fire. The third ethereal world is that of the planetary orb, which contains the sun, moon, and 5 planets, styled by the oracles, erratic animals and fire. He constituted a heptad of erratic animals, and again he constituted them 6, the 7th was that of the sun, mingling fire in them. Chapter 15th. The material worlds. The last and lowest are the material worlds, which Belus and the other summarists assert to be 3, meaning doubtless the air, earth, and water, for so the oracle ranks them, placing the earth in the middle, but the water in the bosom of the earth, the air above them. This is that last order of worlds, of which the Chaldaic summary saith, it is called terrestrial, and the hater of light, it is the region beneath the moon, and comprehends within itself matter, which they call the bottom. By which words it appears upon what ground the Chaldaeans asserted only these sublunary worlds to consist of matter, but the imperial and ethereal to be immaterial though corporeal, for matter they understand to be the hater of light, darkness, and the bottom of a nature quite different from the empyreum and ether, whose very substance is light itself. Yet it is actuated by their vivificative fire, which penetrates quite through it even to the center, as we shewed formerly. Concerning the earth, Diodorus Siculus assaith, they held opinions peculiar to themselves, asserting that it is in figure like a boat, and hollow, for which, as likewise for other things concerning the world, they abound with probable arguments. Belus adds, that they sometimes call this sublunary region Hades. Chapter 16 of Material Daemons. Of daemons, as we said, they asserted two kinds, some good, others ill, the good, light, the ill, dark. The former are those whom Histanes calls the ministers and messengers of God, dwelling in his presence, but these he describes as terrestrial, wandering up and down, and enemies of mankind. Of the first we have treated already, of the latter Belus, in his discourse upon this subject, gives a large account from one Marcus of Mesopotamia, who having been of this religion, and well acquainted with their institutions, was afterwards converted to Christianity. What he relates, as well from the doctrine itself, as from the place, sufficiently appears to be of the Chaldaic tradition. It is to this effect: these daemons are of many kinds, and various sorts, both as to their figures and bodies, insomuch that the air is full of them, as well that which is above us, as that which is round about us. The earth likewise is full, and the sea, and the most retired cavities and depths. There are 6 general kinds of these daemons, the first, named Leliorius, which signifies fiery. This kind dwelleth in the air that is above us, for from the places next about the moon, as being sacred, all kinds of daemons, as being profane, are expelled. The second kind is that which wandereth in the air contiguous to us, and is by many peculiarly called aerial. The third, terrestrial. The fourth, watery and marine. The fifth, subterraneous. The sixth, lucifugus and hardly sensible. All these kinds of daemons are haters of God and enemies of man. Moreover, of these ill daemons, some are worse than others. Aquatic, and subterraneous, and lucifugus, are extremely malicious and pernicious, for these do not hurt souls by phantasms and delusions, but by assault, like the most savage beasts, accelerate the destruction of men. The watery drown those who are sailing upon the water. The subterraneous and lucifugus, insinuating into the entrails, cause epilepsies and frenzy. The aerial and terrestrial circumvent men by art and subtlety, and deceive the minds of men, and draw them to absurd and illegal passions. They affect these things not as having dominion over us, and carrying us as their slaves whithersoever they please, but by suggestion on, for applying themselves to the fantastic spirit, which is within us, they themselves being spirits also, they instill discourses of affections and pleasures, not by voice reverberating the air, but by whisper insinuating their discourse. Nor is it impossible that they should speak without voice, if we consider that he who speaks, being afar off, is forced to use a greater sound. Being near, he speaks softly into the ear of the hearer, and if he could get into the spirit of the soul, he would not need any sound, but what discourse soever he pleaseth, would, by a way without sound, arrive there where it is to be received, which they say is likewise in souls, when they are out of the body, for they discourse with one another without noise. After this manner the daemons converse with us, privately, so as we are not sensible which way the war comes upon us. Neither can this be doubted, if we observe what happens to the air. For, when the sun shineth it assumeth several colors and forms, transmitting them to other things, as we may see in looking glasses. In like manner the daemons, assuming figures and colors, and whatsoever forms they please, transmit them into our animal spirit, and by that means afford us much business, suggesting counsels, representing figures, resuscitating the remembrance of pleasures, exciting the images of passions, as well when we sleep as when we wake, and sometimes, titillating the genital parts, inflame us with frantic and unlawful desires, especially if they take, cooperating with them, the hot humidities which are in us. The rest of the daemons know nothing that is subtile, nor how to breed disturbance, yet are they hurtful and abominable, hurting in the same manner as the spirit or vapor in Charon's cave, for as that is reported to kill whatsoever approacheth it, whether beast, man, or bird. In like manner these daemons destroy those upon whom they chance to fall, overthrowing their souls and bodies, and their natural habits, and sometimes by fire or water or precipice, they destroy not men only but some irrational creatures. The daemons assault irrational creatures, not out of hate, or as wishing them ill, but out of the love they have of their animal heat, for dwelling in the most remote cavities, which are extremely cold and dry, they contract much coldness, wherewith, being afflicted, they affect the humid and animal heat, and to enjoy it, they insinuate themselves into irrational creatures, and go into baths and pits, for they hate the heat of fire and of the sun, because it burns and drieth up. But they most delight in the heat of animals, as being temperate, and mixed with moisture, especially that of men, being best tempered, into which insinuating themselves they cause infinite disturbance, stopping up the pores in which the animal spirit is inherent, and straightening and compressing the spirit, by reason of the grossness of the bodies with which they are endued. Whence it happeneth, that the bodies are disordered, and their principal faculties distempered, and their motions become dull and heavy. Now if the insinuating daemon be one of the subterraneous kind, he distorteth the possessed person, and speaketh by him, making use of the spirit of the patient, as if it were his own organ. But if any of those who are called lucifugus get privately into a man, he causeth relaxation of the limbs, and stoppeth the voice, and maketh the possessed person, in all respects like one that is dead. For this being the last kind of daemons is more earthly and extremely cold and dry, and into whomsoever it insinuates, it nebitates and makes dull all the faculties of his soul. And because it is irrational, void of all intellectual contemplation, and is guided by irrational fantasy, like the more savage kind of beasts, hence it comes to pass, that it stands not in awe of men, and for that reason most persons aptly call it dumb and deaf, nor can they who are possessed with it, by any other means be freed from it, but by the divine favor obtained by fasting and prayer. That physicians endeavor to persuade us, that these passions proceed not from daemons, but from humors, and spirits ill affected, and therefore go about to cure them, not by incantations and expiations, but by medicines and diet, is nothing strange, since they know nothing beyond sense, and are wholly addicted to study the body. And perhaps not without reason, are some things ascribed to ill-affected humors, as lethargies, melancholies, frenzies, which they take away and cure, either by evacuating the humors, or by replenishing the body if it be empty, or by outward applications. But as for enthusiasms, ragings, and unclean spirits, with which whosoever is possessed is not able to act anything, neither by intellect, speech, fantasy, nor sense, or else there is some other thing that moves them unknown to the person possessed, which sometimes foretelleth future events, how can we call these the motions of depraved matter? No kind of daemon is in its own nature male or female, for such affections are only proper to compounds, but the bodies of daemons are simple, and being very ductile and flexible are ready to take any figure. As we see the clouds represent sometimes men, sometimes bears, sometimes dragons, or any other figures, so is it with the demoniac bodies. Now the clouds appear in various figures according as they are driven by exterior blasts of winds, but in daemons, who can pass as they please into any bodies, and sometimes contract, sometimes extend themselves like worms on the earth, being of a soft and tractable nature, not only the bulk is changed, but the figure and color, and that several ways, for the demoniac body being by nature capable of all these, as it is apt to recede it is changed into several forms, as it is aerial. It is susceptible of all sorts of colors, like air, but the air is colored by something extrinsical. The demoniac body, from its intrinsical fantastic power and energy, produceth the forms of colors in itself, as we sometimes look pale, sometimes red, according as the soul is affected either with fear or anger. The like we must imagine of daemons, for from within they send forth several kinds of colors into their bodies. Thus their bodies being changed into what figure, and assuming what color they please, they sometimes appear in the shape of a man, sometimes of a woman, of a lion, of a leopard, of a wild boar, sometimes in the figure of a bottle, and sometimes like a little dog fawning upon us. Into all these forms they change themselves, but keep none of them constantly, for the figure is not solid, but immediately is dissipated, as when we pour something colored into water, or draw a figure in the air. In like manner it is with daemons, their color, figure, and form presently vanish. But all daemons have not the same power and will, there is much inequality amongst them as to these. Some there are irrational, as amongst compound animals, for as of them, man, participating of intellect and reason, hath also a larger fantasy, extending also to all sensibles as well in the heavens, as on earth and under the earth, but horses, oxen, and the like, have a narrower and more particular fantasy, yet such as extends to the knowledge of the creatures that feed with them, their mangers and their masters. Lastly, flies, gnats, and worms have it extremely contracted, and incoherent, for they know neither the hole out of which they came, nor whither they go, nor whither they ought to go, they have only one fantasy, which is that of aliment. In like manner there are different kinds of daemons. Of these some are fiery, others aerial. These have a various fantasy, which is capable of extending to anything imaginable. The subterraneous and lucifugus are not of this nature, whence it comes to pass, that they make not use of many figures, as neither having variety of phantasms, nor a body apt for action and transformation. But the watery and terrestrial, being of middle kind between these, are capable of taking many forms, but keep themselves constantly to that in which they delight. They which live in humid places, transform themselves into the shapes of birds and women, whence termed by the Greeks Naiades and Nereides and Dryades in the feminine gender. But such as are conversant in dry places have also dry bodies, such as the Anosceles are said to be. These transform themselves into men, sometimes into dogs, lions, and the like animals, which are of a masculine disposition. The bodies of daemons are capable of being struck, and are pained thereby, though they are not compounds, for sense is not only proper to compounds. That thing in man which feeleth is neither the bone nor the nerve, but the spirit which is in them. Whence if the nerve be pressed or seized with cold or the like, there ariseth pain from the emission of one spirit into another spirit, for it is impossible that a compound body should in itself be sensible of pain, but inasmuch as it partaketh of spirit, and therefore being broken into pieces, or dead, it is absolutely insensible, because it hath no spirit. In like manner, a daemon being all spirit, is of his own nature sensible in every part. He immediately seeth, and heareth, he is obnoxious to suffering by touch, being cut asunder, he is pained like solid bodies. Only herein differing from them that other things being cut asunder, can by no means or very hardly be made whole again, whereas the daemon immediately cometh together again, as air or water parted by some more solid body. But though this spirit joins again in a moment, nevertheless, at the very time in which the dissection is made, it is pained. Hitherto the theology and physic of the Chaldaeans. The second section, astrology and other arts of divination. The second part of the Chaldaic learning consists in arts of divination, the chief whereof was astrology. This, as it is generally acknowledged to have been their proper invention, so were they most particularly addicted to it, for which Ptolemy gives a reason, out of the art itself, because they are under Virgo and Mercury, but Cicero one, much better, that the plainness and evenness of the country did invite them to contemplation of the stars. It consists of two parts, one meteorologic, which considers the motions of the stars, the other apotelesmatic, which regards divination. The first was known to the ancient Grecians by the common names of astronomy and astrology, until the other being brought into Greece also they for distinction called the former more particularly astronomy, the latter astrology. The excellent Joseph Scaliger, to advance the credit of the Greek learning, constantly avers that the Chaldaeans had only a gross and general, not exact knowledge of astronomy, and that the Greeks learned nothing therein of the Chaldaeans, when as Aristotle ingenuously acknowledgeth the contrary, the Egyptians and Babylonians, saith he, from whom we have many informations concerning each of the stars, though doubtless they were far short of that height in this art, to which the Greeks who brought it out of the East improved it. For Diodorus Siculus affirms that they alleged very weak reasons for the eclipses of the sun, which eclipses they neither durst foretell nor reduce to certain periods. But of the apotelesmatic part they boasted themselves not only the inventors, but masters, insomuch that all the professors of it, of what country soever, were called after them Chaldaeans. Of the stars fixed and erratic, and of their praesignification, they first lay down for a ground, that terrestrials sympathize with the celestials, and that every one of these is renewed by the influence of these For every man's endued with such a mind, as by the sire of gods and men's assigned. Above all things they hold that our act and life is subjected to censor, the stars, as well to the erratic as the fixed, and that mankind is governed by their various and multiplicitous course, that the planets are of the kind of efficient causes in everything that happens in life, and that the signs of the zodiac cooperate with them, that they confer all good and ill to the nativities of men, and that by contemplation of their natures may be known the chief things that happen to men. They held the principal gods to be 12, to each of which they attributed a month, and one of the signs of the zodiac. Next the zodiac they assert 24 stars, whereof half they say are ranked in the northern parts, the other half in the southern. These they which are apparent they conceive to be deputed to the living, the inapparent congregated to the dead. These they call judges of all things, detained. But the greatest observation and theory they hold to be that concerning the 5 stars termed planets, which they call the interpreters. Because the rest of the stars being fixed and having a settled course, these only having a peculiar course foretell things that shall come to pass, interpreting and declaring to men the benevolence of the gods. For some things they presignify by their rising, some things by their setting, some things by their color if observed, Sometimes they foretell great winds, sometimes extraordinary rains or drought. Likewise the rising of comets, and eclipses of the sun, and of the moon, and earthquakes. And in a word, all alterations in the air signify things advantageous or hurtful not only to nations or countries, but even to kings and private persons. Beneath the course of these, they hold that there are placed 30 stars, which they call conciliary gods, that half of these oversee the places under the earth, the other half oversee the earth and the business of men, and what is done in the heavens, and that every 10 days one of these is sent to those below as a messenger, and in like manner one of the stars under the earth is sent to those above, and that they have this certain motion settled in an eternal revolution. Chapter 2 of Planets. The greatest theory they hold to be that which concerns the planets. These they call the interpreters, because whereas the rest of the stars are fixed and have one settled course, these having their proper courses foretell what things shall come to pass, interpreting and declaring to men the benevolence of the gods. Of the heaven they hold the sun and moon to be the chief, and that the other 5 have less power than they, as to the causing events. Of the 5 they affirm that there are 3 which agree with and are assistant to the sun, viz. Saturn, Jupiter, and Mercury. These they call diurnal, because the sun to whom they are assistant predominates over the things that are done in the day. As concerning the powers of the 5, some they say are benevolent, others malevolent, others common. The benevolent are Jupiter, and Venus, the malevolent Mars and Saturn, the common, Mercury, who is benevolent with the benevolent, and malevolent with the malevolent. Chapter 3. The divisions of the zodiac. According to Sextus Empiricus, the Chaldaeans having at first no certain rule of observation of the other stars, inasmuch as they contemplated not the signs, as within their proper circumscriptions, but only together with their observation of the 7 planets, it came at length into their minds to divide the whole circle into 12 parts. The manner they relate thus: they say that the Antiquans, having observed some one bright star of those in zodiac, filled a vessel with water, and let the water run into another vessel placed underneath, so long until the same star rose again, collecting that from the same signi to the same, was the whole revolution of the circle. Then they took the 12th part of the water which had run out, and considered how long it was in running, affirming that the 12th part of the circle passed over in the same space of time, and that it had that proportion to the whole circle which the part of water had to the whole water. By this analogy they marked out the extreme term from some signal star, which then appeared, or from some that arose within that time, northern or southern. The same course they took in the rest of the Dodecatemoria. That to each of these Dodecatemoria, the ancient Chaldaeans applied a particular figure and a character, though denied by the learned A. John Picus Marangela, seems manifest enough from what we find ascribed peculiarly to them by Ptolemy, Sextus Empiricus, and others, which we shall cite in their due places. BTO each of these signs they appropriated one of the principal gods which they held to be 12, and one of the months, the zodiac itself, they termed the circle Mazaloth, which the Septuagint render Pasupwe, interpreted by Suidas the constellations which are commonly termed zodiac signs, for Mazal signifieth a star. That they ascribed several gods to them agreeth with what is said of the followers of Baal: they burnt incense unto Baal, to the sun, and to the moon, and to the Mazaloth, and to all the host of heaven. Hence, some are of opinion that Homer received this doctrine from the Egyptians, as the Egyptians from the Chaldaeans, alluding to it in the first of his Iliads, where he mentions the entertainment of Jupiter and the rest of the gods in Ethiopia 12 days, with the several houses built for them by Vulcan. And much better deserve they to be credited than those Antiquans who write that Homer first gave the hint of this opinion to the mathematicians. Neither is what he adds in explication of this mythology dissonant from the Chaldaic doctrine, that the making those mansions for the gods or stars is ascribed to Vulcan in respect of the ethereal heat of the celestial orb. Of the signs, some they call masculine, others feminine, some double, others single, some tropical, others solid. The masculine or feminine are those which have a nature that cooperates towards the generation of males or females. Aries is a masculine signy, Taurus a feminine, Gemini a masculine. In like manner, the rest alternately are masculine and feminine, in imitation of whom, as I conceive, the Pythagoreans call the monad masculine, the dual feminine, the triad masculine, and so on through all numbers odd and even. Some there are who divide every signy into 12 parts, observing almost the same order, as in Aries they call the first 12th part Aries and masculine, the second Taurus and feminine, the third Gemini and masculine, and so of the rest. Double signs are Gemini, and its diametrically opposites Sagittarius, Virgo, and Pisces. The rest are single, Tropical are those to which when the sun cometh he turneth back, and maketh a conversion, such as the Cygni Aries, and its opposite Libra, Capricorn and Cancer. In Aries is the spring. Some Chaldaeans there are, who attribute the several parts of man's body to particular signs, as sympathizing with them, to Aries the head, to Taurus the neck, to Gemini the shoulders, Cancer the breast, Leo the sides, Virgo the bowels and belly, Libra the reins and loins, Scorpio the secret parts and womb, Sagittarius the thighs, Capricorn the knees, Aquarius the legs, Pisces the feet. This did they not without consideration. For if any star shall be in any ascension of these malignant signs, it will cause a maim in that part which bears the same name with it. Thus much in brief of the nature of the signs in the zodiac. Sextus Empiricus. In the same place cited besides this division of the zodiac into Synesa, they subdivided every Cygni into 30 degrees, every degree into 60 minutes. So they call the least indivisible parts. The degrees being in every Cygni 30 are in the whole zodiac 360. In some one of these the sun must necessarily be at the time of the nativity, which degree the Chaldaeans properly call the place of the birth. Hence the Greeks call these degree moirai in allusion to the Muomikronohol Phyota goddesses of destiny, these being our fates, for it is of greatest importance which of these degrees is ascendant at the time of birth. 3 other ways there are of dividing of the zodiac ascribed to the Chaldaeans, which are triplicities, terms, deconates. The trigons or triplicities are these four. The first is Aries, Leo, Sagittarius, the second Taurus, Virgo, Capricorn, the third Gemini, Libra, Aquarius, the last Cancer, Scorpio, Pisces. That the Chaldaeans divided the zodiac according to these triplicities is manifest from their way of collecting the terms of the planets described by Ptolemy. Every Cygni hath 5 terms b. The Chaldaic way of finding out the quantity of the terms in every Cygni is 1, and that very plain, for their quantities differ by an equal diminution. Every term is lesser than the precedent by 1 degree, for they made the first term of every Cygni to be 8 degrees, the second 7, the third 6, the fourth 5, the fifth 4, which make up 30 degrees. Lastly, the signs are divided into faces, for so the Antians called Themk, in Hebrew Phanaim, in Arabic Migja, in Greek Perhumikron Sigmal Pialpha, but the latter astrologers deconates dealt epsilon kapal fan u omicron upsilons decanos, a word derived from the Roman militia. Of these in every Cygni there are 3, each of which comprehends 10 degrees. That the Chaldaeans were not ignorant of these is manifest, inasmuch as Emer the Babylonian and author of great Antiquity wrote concerning them. Chapter 4th of the planets considered in respect to the zodiac. The Chaldaeans held that the planets have not always power alike, as to the procuring of good and ill, but that in some places they are more efficacious, in others less, and that the same stars have greater power being in their proper houses, or in their exaltations or terms, or deconates. All which the later astrologers call their essential dignities. The most efficacious is that of houses. They hold the sun's house to be Leo, the moon's Cancer, Saturn's Capricorn and Aquarius, Jupiter's Sagittarius and Pisces, that of Mars Aries and Scorpio, that of Venus Taurus and Libra, that of Mercury Gemini and Virgo. They call the exaltations and depressions of the planets, when they are in signs wherewith they are delighted, or when they are in those in which they have little power, for they are delighted in their exaltations, but have little power in their depressions. As the sun's exaltation is in Aries when he is exactly in the 19th degree thereof, his depression in the sign and degree diametrically opposite to it. The moon's exaltation is in Taurus, her depression in the sign diametrically opposite. That of Saturn is in Libra, of Jupiter in Cancer, of Mars in Capricorn, of Venus in Pisces, and their depressions are in the signs diametrically opposite to their exaltations. The trigones or triplicities of planets are ordered by the Chaldaeans after this manner. The lord of the first triplicity is Jupiter, of the second Venus, the same order they observe in the other 2 triplicities, except that the third is said to have 2 lords, Saturn and Mercury. The first part of the day is assigned to Saturn, the night to Mercury. The lord of the last triplicity is Mars. How much this differs from the vulgar way will easily appear to those who will take the pains to compare them. The later way see in Firmicus. They call the terms of the planets in every sign, these in which any planet from such a degree to such a degree is most powerful or prevalent. The Chaldaic way of terms is gathered from the lords of the triplicities, yet neither in their orders or quantities do they always follow those planets which govern the triplicities. In the first triplicity, their division of terms in every sign thereof is one and the same. The first term they give to the lord of the triplicity Jupiter, the second to the lord of the following triplicity Venus, the third and fourth. To the two lords of the triplicity of the Gemini, which are Saturn and Mercury, the fifth, to the lord of the last triplicity Mars. In the second triplicity they divide every sign alike, and allot the first term to Venus, by reason of her dominion in that triplicity, the second, and third to the two lords of the triplicity of the Gemini, which are Saturn and Mercury, the fourth to Mars, the last to Jupiter. To Saturn are attributed in the day 66 degrees, in the night 78, to Jupiter 72, to Mars 60, to Venus 75, to Mercury in the day 66, in the night 78. The decanates or faces of the planets have reference to those of the zodiac. The first face is that planet whose sign it is, the second the next planet, and so on. That these were of Anti and Chaldaic invention is manifest, not only in regard that Tusser the Babylonian wrote concerning them, but likewise they were observed by the Egyptians who derived this learning from the Chaldaeans. Nisipso king of Egypt, a most just governor, and excellent astrologer, did collect all sicknesses from the decanates, shewing what diseases every decanate caused, because one nature was overcome by another, and one god by another. The same author adds, that Pedosiris touched this part of astrology but lightly, not as being ignorant of it, but not willing to communicate his immortal learning to posterity. Chapter 5. Aspects of the signs and planets. Every sign of the zodiac hath a mutual aspect to the rest. In like manner the planets have several aspects. They are said to be in mutual aspect or configuration, when they appear either in trine or square. They are said to behold one another in trine, when there is an interposition of 3 signs between them, in square or quartile, when of 2. The sun passing into the sign next to that, wherein he was at the time of birth, regards the place of conception either with a very weak aspect, or not at all, for most of the Chaldaeans have absolutely deemed that the signs which are next to one another behold one another, but when he is in the third sign, that is, when there is a sign betwixt them, then he is said to behold the first place, whence he came, but with a very oblique and weak light, which aspect is termed sextile, for it subtends the 6th part of a circle. For if we draw lines from the first sign to the third, from the third to the 5th, and from thence to the 7th, and so on, we shall describe an equilateral hexagon. This aspect they did not wholly, for that it seemed to conduce the least to the nativity of the child. But when he comes to the 4th sign, so that there are 2 betwixt, he looks on it with a quarterly aspect, for that line which his aspect makes, cuts off a 4th part of the circle. When he is in the 5th, there being 3 betwixt, it is a trine aspect, for it subtends a 3rd part of the zodiac, which 2 aspects, the quartile and trine being very efficacious, afford much increase to the birth. But the aspect from the 6th place is wholly inefficacious, for the line there makes not a side of any polygon, but from the 7th sign, which is the opposite, the aspect is most full and powerful, and bringeth forth some infants already mature, termed septimestries, from being born in the 7th month. But if within that space it be not mature, in the 8th month it is not born, for from the 8th sign as from the 6th, the aspect is inefficacious, but either in the 9th month or in the 10th, for the sun from the 9th sign beholds again the particle of the conception in a trine aspect, and from the 10th in a quartile, which aspects, as we said, are very efficacious. But in the 11th month they hold it cannot be born, because then, the light being weak, sends first his languishing ray in a sextile aspect, much less in the 12th, which aspect is not at all valid. Chapter 6. Schemes. According to Sextus Empiricus, the way by which the Chaldaeans from the very beginning observed the horoscope of any nativity corresponds with that of their division of the zodiac. For a Chaldaean sate in the night time on some high promontory contemplating the stars, another sate by the woman in travail until such time as she were delivered. As soon as she was delivered, he signified it to him on the promontory, which as soon as he had heard, he observed the sign then rising for the horoscope, but in the day he attended the ascendants and sun's motion. Of the 12 parts or houses into which the zodiac is divided, those which are predominant in every nativity, and chiefly to be considered in prognostics, are 4. But more particularly, they call one the horoscope or ascendant, another the medium coeli, another the descendant, another the subterrestrial and opposite to the medium coeli. The horoscope is that which happens to be ascendant at the time of the birth. The medium coeli is the 4th sign inclusively from it. The descendant is that which is opposite to the horoscope. The subterrestrial and emum coeli, that which is opposite to the medium coeli, as if Cancer be the horoscope. Aries is the medium coeli, Capricorn descendant, and Libra subterrestrial. That house, which goes before either of these houses they call cadent, and that which followeth the medium coeli of the good genius, that which is before the medium coeli, the inferior portion and single lot, and God. That which is before the descendant, a slothful sign and the beginning of death, that which is after the ascendant, and is not apparent to us, the fury and ill fortune, that which cometh under the earth, good fortune, opposite to the good genius, that which is beyond the emum coeli towards the east, goddess, that which followeth the horoscope, slothful, which also is opposite to the slothful. Or more briefly thus, the cadent of the horoscope is called the ill genius, the cadent of the medium coeli, God, the cadent of the emum coeli, goddess, the succeedent good fortune, the cadent of the descendant ill fortune, the succeedent slothful. These, as they conceive, ought to be examined not superficially. Upon these grounds the Chaldaeans made their apotalismatic predictions, for some of them are more simple, others more accurate. The more simple, those which are made from any one sign or the simple force of a single star, as that a star being in such a sign shall cause such kind of men. The more accurate, those which are made by the concourse, and as they say, the contemperation of many. As if one star be in the horoscope, another in the mid-heaven, another in the opposite point to the mid-heaven, others thus or thus posited, then these or these things will come to pass. These are all the remains of this art, which can be attributed to the ancient Chaldaeans. Chapter 7. Other Arts of Divination. The Chaldaeans, besides astrology, invented and used many other ways of divination, of which Diodorus Siculus Libri Primi maintaineth divination by birds, interpretation of dreams, explication of prodigies, and hieroscope. Rabbi Maimonides likewise affirms that amongst the Chaldeans antiently there arose several sorts of diviners, in particular these, Meku-onemen, Menacheshim, Mesaphethim, Chober-Shaber, Shelob, Gideoni, Dorashael-Hamathem, all which are mentioned. The first ascribed by Diodorus to the Chaldeans is divination of birds, Oyonon Mantea, or augury. Neither is it probable that they who were so great inquisitors into the several kinds of divination should be ignorant of this, which after ages esteemed one of the most considerable. But they who understand the word Menacheshim in this sense seem to have been drawn to it by a mistake of the Latin word augurari, by which it is rendered. The next, interpretation of dreams, exiatagamasic mepsiloniotas and yupsilon pinuio meganu, Philo Judah USD affirms to have been invented by Abraham. Indeed, that it was professed by the Antient Chaldeans appears from their answer to Nebuchadnezzar. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will shew the interpretation. There are extant many oniricritical verses, under the name of Asphampsechus, collected out of Suidas, and digested by Joseph Scaliger. Asphampsechus is mentioned amongst the Magi by Laertius, and there are who conceive the name to be only an interpretation of the Chaldean or Persian Zoroaster, which some render a living star. The third, explication of prodigies, sigmaitim epsilonio meganu tau epsilon rol fato epsiloni alpha. This kind the Greek interpreters conceive included in the word Gideoni, for they render it tau epsilon rol alpha tau omicron sigma kapiopi omicrons, or terata logos. The last that Diodorus mentions is hieroscopy, by which I conceive to be meant ex dispicium, divination by inspection into the entrails of sacrificed beasts. That the Chaldeans used this kind may be argued from the prophet Ezekiel, who saith of the king of Babylon, he looked into the liver. These seem to be the Gazarin, reckoned by Daniel amongst the Chaldean diviners, from Gazar, to cut, for they cut open the beast and divined by his entrails. Ob is rendered python, or pythonicus spiritus. The word originally signifieth a bottle, and thereupon is taken for that spirit which speaketh ex utero pythonisse. The sacred text calls the woman Elisheth Balath Ob, which the Septuagint render, Gamopsilon nu iota kappa alpha egastrimuthon, and where Saul saith, I pray thee divine unto me in Ob, they translate, nu alpha nu tau epsilonu sigma alpha iota delte mu omicroniota enu tau egastremutho. Rabbi Maimonides saith, she that was initiated held in her hand a myrtle wand, and recited fumigations. Rabbi Abraham ben David, that these rites were usually performed at some dead man's tomb. Dorashael Hamatem is properly a necromancer. Some affirm this kind of divination had its original in Chaldea Dake. These and the rest of this kind are all comprehended under the general name Mesaphethim, of which formerly. The third section. Magic, natural, and thurgic. The third part of the Chaldaic doctrine was magic, For though the name is conceived to be Persian, yet this science itself was originally Chaldean, and properly the study of the Asaphalim, of whom Lucretius is to be understood, when he saith that the Chaldaeans were the same with the Babylonians as the Magi with the Persians. Hence is it also that the term Magi is sometimes extended to the Chaldean philosophers. Pliny indeed saith that magic had its beginning in Persia from Zoroaster, but adds that whether this Zoroaster was one, or afterwards a second also, is not certain, and that he rather meant the Chaldean than the Persian may be inferred from his citing those authors who placed this Zoroaster 6,000 years before Plato, or 5,000 years before the Trojan War, which accounts were doubtless intended of the most antient Zoroaster, the Chaldean. He likewise instanceth Be as skillful in this art. Marmarides a Babylonian and Zeromsintus an Assyrian, both so antient as that there are not any monuments of them extant. The few remains we find of the Chaldean magic may be reduced to two kinds, natural and theurgic. Chapter I. Natural magic. The first part of the Chaldaic magic is that which we commonly term natural, because it contemplates the virtues of all natural beings. Celestial and sublunary, make scrutiny into their sympathy, and by a mutual application of them, produceth extraordinary effects. By this kind of magic the Chaldaeans professed be to perform many admirable things, not only upon particular persons but upon whole countries. Rabbi Maimonides instanceth the expelling of noxious animals, as lions, serpents and the like, out of cities, the driving away all kind of harms from plants, prevention of hail, the destroying of worms that they hurt not the vines. Concerning these they have written much in their books, and some there are who boast they can cause that no leaves or fruit shall fall from the trees. Chapter 2. Magical operation, their kinds. Their operation a Rabbi Maimonides reduceth to three kinds. The first is of those which deal in plants, animals and metals. The second consists in circumscription and determination of some time, in which the operations are to be performed. The third consists in human gestures and actions, as in clapping the hands, leaping, crying aloud, laughing, lying prostrate on the earth, burning of anything, kindling of smoke, and lastly in pronouncing certain words intelligible or unintelligible. These are the kinds of their magical operations. B. Some there are which are not performed but by all these kinds, as when they say, take such a leaf of such an herb when the moon is in such a degree and place, or take of the horn of such a beast, or of his hair, sweat or blood, such a quantity, when the sun is in the middle of heaven, or in some other certain place. Or, take of such a metal, or of many metals, melt them under such a constellation, and in such a position of the moon, then pronounce such and such words, make a suffumigation of such and such leaves, in such and such a figure, and this or that thing shall come to pass. Other magical operations there are which they conceive may be performed by one of the forementioned kinds, only these are performed for the most part by women, as we find amongst them for the bringing forth of waters. If 10 virgins shall adorn themselves and put on red garments, and leap in such manner that one shall thrust on the other, and this to be done going backwards and forwards, and afterwards shall stretch out their fingers towards the sun, making certain signs, this action being finished, they say that waters will issue forth. In like manner they write, that if some women etc. using certain words and certain gestures, by this action they shall divert hail from falling down. Many other such like vanities they mention all along their writings, which are to be performed by women. But none of these can be performed without having respect and consideration of the stars. For they conceive that every plant hath its proper star, they ascribe also certain stars to all living creatures and metals. Moreover these operations are peculiar worships of the stars, and that they are delighted with such an action or speech or suffumigation, and for its sake afford them what they wish. Hitherto Rabbi Maimonides, who only hath preserved these remains of the antient Chaldaic superstition. Chapter 3. Of the talismans used for avaruncation. Moreover, the Chaldaeans are by the rabbis reported to have been the first that found out the secret power of figures. Neither was there anything more syllabarious than the images of this kind made by them. They are called in Chaldee and Persian silmania, from the Hebrew selim, an image, in Arabic talisman or salimam. Perhaps from the same root, rather than as some conjecture from the Greek word tau lambda epsilon sigma mu alpha, tau epsilon lambda epsilon sigma mu nu omicron tau iota. These images were prepared under certain constellations, for several purposes, some for avaruncation, others for prediction. Those that serve for avaruncation, some conceive to have been of later invention, and ascribe them to Apollonius Tyaneus, he indeed was the first amongst the Grecians that was famous for them, but it is most probable that he brought this art out of the East, there being yet to be seen many of these figures or telesms throughout the whole eastern part of the world, and some of them very ancient. Which Agafarel allegeth to confirm, that the Persians, or if you will the Babylonians or Chaldaeans, were the first that found them out. These the Greeks term also stoicheia, and sigma to omicroniotas epsiloniotas sigma epsiloniotas, and the makers of them stoicheomatics be Ptolemy. The generable and corruptible forms are affected by the celestial forms, for which reason the stoicheomatics make use of them, considering the entrance of the stars into them. On which words Hali Aben Rodoan writes thus. In this chapter Ptolemy means to discover many secrets of images, and that the figures which are here below are correspondent to the like figurations above, which predominate over them. As for instance, the celestial scorpion predominates over the terrestrial scorpions, and the celestial serpent over the terrestrial serpents, and the skillful in images observed, when a planet was out of his combustion, and entered into any of these figures, then placing the planet in the horoscope, they engraved the figure upon a stone, and having added what else was necessary, they fitted it for preservation or destruction as they pleased, and this power continued in the stone a long time after. Chapter 4th of the Talismania, used for prediction. Another kind there was of Silmania or telesms, used for prediction. These images they did erect to the stars, of gold to the sun, of silver to the moon, and so distributed the metals and climates of the earth among the stars, for they said, that such a star is the god of such a climate. There they built temples, and placed the images in them, conceiving that the power of the stars did flow into those images. Spiritual virtues of the stars are infused into that tree, so that after the manner of prophecy they discourse to men, and speak to them also in dreams. The word teraphim in the sacred scripture, amongst other significations, is sometimes taken for these images. When Sebonkelos the Chaldee paraphrased renders it Silmania, with which the Syriac version agrees. The Septuagint alamda lambda omegas, and apiomicron beta epsilon beta eta kapao tau epsilons, and phi omega tau iota sig mamwos, implying by all these interpretations, that they were endued with the gift of prediction, which is no more than the text itself confirms, for Ezekiel saith of the king of Babylon using divination, that he consulted the teraphim. Of this kind are those teraphim conceived to be, which Rachel stole from her father Laban, for he calls them his gods. The Coptic version renders it, the greatest of his gods. Rabbi David Kimchi conceives they were made by astrologers to foretell things to come, and that they were images whose figures we know not, by which the Antiants were informed of future events, they being in some manner like the oracles which often spake by the mouth of the devil. Rabbi Eliezer, that they were statues made in the figure of men under certain constellations, whose influences caused them to speak at some set hours, and give an answer to whatsoever was demanded of them. Aben Ezra, that they were made after the shapes of men, to the end they might be capable of celestial influence, adding, that the reason why Rachel took them away, was not to take her father off from idolatry, for if it were so, why then did she take them along with her, and not rather hide them in the way near his house? Rather hide them in the way near his house, but by reason that her father was skillful in astrology, she feared lest by consulting those images in the stars, he should know which way Jacob was gone. And St. Augustine, that Laban saith, Why hast thou stolen my gods? It is perhaps inasmuch as he had said he divined, I divined the Lord blessed me because of thee, for so the more antient. Expositors interpret the word nikashti, and the Jews understand that place, of prescience, divination, or conjecture, as Mr. Selden observes. Philo Judaeus, speaking of Theb Teraphim of Micah, fancies that Micah made of fine gold and silver 3 images of young lads, and 3 calves, and 1 lion, 1 dragon, and 1 dove, so that if any had a mind to know any secret concerning his wife, he was to have recourse to the image of the dove which answered his demands. If concerning his children, he went to the ease; if concerning power and strength, to the lion; if anything concerned sons and daughters, he went then to the calves; and if about the length of years and days, he was to consult the image of the dragon. This, how light soever, shews that he also understood the teraphim to be prophetical. Chapter 5. Thurgic Magic. The other part of the Chaldaic magic is Thurgic, to which perhaps Plato more particularly alluded, when he defined the magic of Zoroaster, the service of the gods. This they called alsab the method of rites, the works of piety, and to epsilon lam de epsilon sigmatau iotakapainu epiota sigmatau muetanu, the telestic science and telesiurgic. In what it did consist may be gathered from what Suidas saith of the two Julians, Julian the Chaldaean, a philosopher, father of Julian surnamed the Thurgic. He wrote of demons, 4 books. They treat of preservatives of every part of man's body, of which kind are the Chaldaic telesiurgics. And again Julian, son of the aforementioned, lived under Marcus Antoninus the emperor. He also wrote Thurgic initiatory oracles in verse, and all other secrets of the science. Thus the telistic science was conceived to procure a conversation with demons by certain rites and ceremonies, and to initiate or perfect the soul by the power of materials here on earth, for the supreme faculty of the soul cannot by its own guidance aspire to the sublimest institution, and to the comprehension of divinity, but the work of piety leads it by the hand to God by illumination from thence. Plato indeed holds that we may comprehend the numerical essence by reason and intellect, but the Chaldaean asserts that there is no other means for us to arrive at God but by strengthening the vehicle of the soul by material rites, for he supposeth that the soul is purified by stones and herbs and charms, and is rendered expedito for ascent. It is likewise beneficial to the body, as well as to the soul. For if a man shall give his mind to these, he shall not only render his soul unvanquishable by passions, but shall also preserve his body the better in health, for the usual effect of divine illuminations is to consume the matter of the body, and to establish nature by health, that we be not seized either by passions or diseases. Chapter 6. Thurgic Rites. By Thurgic or telistic rites they conceived that they could procure a communication with the good daemons, and expulsion or avaruncation of the bad. The chief of these rites was sacrifice, concerning which there is a remarkable passage in Iamblichus, who delivers the Chaldaic opinion thus: the gods give those things that are truly good to such as are purified by sacrifices, with whom also they converse, and by their communication drive away wickedness and passion far from them, and by their brightness chase from thence the dark spirits, for the evil spirits when the light of the gods cometh in, fly away as shadows at the light of the sun, neither are they able any longer to disturb the pious sacrificer, who is free from all wickedness, perverseness and passion, but such as are peracious, and behave themselves insolently in opposition to sacred rites and orders. These by reason of the imbecility of their action, and want of power, are not able to attain to the gods, but, because of certain pollutions, are driven away from the gods, and associated with ill daemons, by whose bad breath they are inspired, and depart thence most wicked, profane and dissolute, unlike the gods in desire, but in all things resembling the bad daemons with whom they converse daily. These men therefore being full of passion and wickedness, by the affinity that is betwixt them, draw the evil spirits to them, by whom, being quickly possessed, they are again excited to all iniquity, one assisting and strengthening the other, like a circle whose beginning and end meet. Several other rites they used also, which they conceived to be prevalent in evocation of these daemons. They are allured out of the air and earth by certain stones or pulses, or certain voices or figures, which they call characters, invented by the Chaldaeans and Egyptians, who first found out the proper diagnostic sign of every daemon. When thou seest the terrestrial daemon approach, sacrifice the stone Maimzuris, using invocation. The daemons that are near the earth are by nature lying, as being far off from the divine knowledge, and filled with dark matter. Now, if you would have any true discourse from these, prepare an altar, and sacrifice the stone Maimzuris. This stone hath the power of evocations. The other greater daemon who invisibly approacheth to the material daemon, will labor about the Hecatine Strophilos. A De Mysteriis Egyptiorum by Iamblichus, discussing sacrificial purification and daemonic repulsion. B. Nicephorus Gregoris, in Synesius. On ancient invocations and daemonic signatures by Chaldeans and Egyptians. The Hecatine Strophilos, and 'tis a golden ball, in the midst whereof is a sapphire. They fold about it a leather thong, it is beset all over with characters, thus whipping it about they made their invocations. These they use to call tyages, whether it be round or triangle, or any other figure, and whilst they are doing thus they make insignificant or brutish cries, and lash the air with their whips. The oracle adviseth to the performance of these rites, or such a motion of the Strophilos, as having an expressible power. It is called Hecatine, as being dedicated to Hecate. Hecate is a goddess amongst the Chaldaeans, having at her right side the fountain of virtues. No little efficacy was attributed to certain words used in these rites, which the Chaldaic oracles expressly forbid to be changed. Never change barbarous names. There are certain names among all nations delivered to them by God, which have an unspeakable power in divine rights. Change not these into the Greek dialect, as seraphim and cherubim, and Michael and Gabriel. These in the Hebrew dialect have an unspeakable efficacy in divine rights, but changed into Greek names are ineffectual. Apselus, commentary on the Chaldaic oracles, citing rituals and symbolic objects such as the Strophilos dedicated to Hecate. Chapter 7 Apparitions. The apparitions procured by these rites are of two kinds. First is called epiomicron epsilon alpha, superinspection. When he who orders the divine rites seeth a mere apparition of light in some figure or form concerning which the Chaldaic oracle adviseth, that if anyone sees such a light, he apply not his mind to it, nor esteem the voice proceeding from thence to be true. Sometimes likewise to many initiated persons there appears, whilst they are sacrificing some apparitions in the shape of dogs and several other figures. These are apparitions of the passions. The second is called alpha tawomicrompsy alpha, self-inspection. This is when the initiated person seeth the divine light itself without any figure or form. This the oracle calls epsilonusig epsilon betis, sacrosanct, for that it is seen intent with a beauty by sacred persons, and glides up and down pleasantly and graciously through the depths of the world. This will not deceive the initiated person, but whatsoever question you shall propose, the answer will be most true. When thou seest in sacred fire, without form, stirring flashingly through the depths of the whole world, hear the voice of fire. G. When thou beholdest the divine fire void of figure brightly gliding up and down the world, and graciously smiling, listen to this voice, as bringing a most perfect prescience. Both these things which appear to initiated persons as thunder, lightning, and all else whatsoever, are only symbols or signs, not the nature of God. Chapter 8. Material daemons how to be repulsed. As it is one property of theurgy to evocate and procure a conversation with good daemons, so is it another, to repulse and chase away the material daemons, which as they conceive may be effected several ways, either by words or actions. By words for these material daemons fearing to be sent to abysses and subterraneal places, and standing in awe the angels who send them thither, if a man threaten to send them thither, and pronounce the names of those angels whose office that is, it is hardly to be expressed how much they will be affrighted and troubled, so great will their astonishment be, as that they are not able to discern the person that menaces them, and though it be some old woman or a little old man that threatens them, yet so great is their fear, that commonly they depart as if he that menaces were able to kill them. By actions, for the bodies of daemons are capable of being struck, and are pained thereby. Sense is not the property of compounds, but of spirits. That thing in a man which feeleth is neither the bone nor the nerve, but the spirit which is in them. Whence if the nerve be pressed or seized with cold or the like, there ariseth pain from the emission of one spirit into another spirit, for it is impossible that a compound body should in itself be sensible of pain, but inasmuch as it partaketh of spirit, and therefore being cut into pieces or dead, it is absolutely insensible, because it hath no spirit. In like manner a daemon being all spirit is of his own nature sensible in every part, he immediately seeth and he heareth, he is obnoxious to suffering by touch. Being cut asunder he is pained like solid bodies, only herein differing from them, that other things being cut asunder, can by no means or very hardly be made whole again, whereas the daemon immediately cometh together again, as air or water parted by some more solid body. But though this spirit joys again in a moment, nevertheless at the very time in which the dissection is made it is pained. For this reason they are much afraid of swords, which they who chase them away knowing, stick up pointed irons or swords in those places where they would not have them come, chasing them away by things antithetical to them, as they allure them by things sympathetical. From these material daemons, upon those that worship them, descend certain fiery irradiations, like those we call falling stars, gliding up and down, which those mad persons term apparitions of gods, but there is nothing true, firm or certain in them, but cheats, like those of jugglers, which the common people term wonders, because they deceive the eye. Afore being removed far from the beatitude of divine life, and destitute of intellectual contemplation, they cannot presignify futures, but all that they say or shew is false and not solid, for they know beings muomikronrophio megatauiotokopos by their outsides, but that which knoweth futures particularly, useth notions indivisible and not figured. The fourth section. Of the gods and religious worship of the Chaldaeans. In the last place, it is necessary we give account of the gods of the Chaldaeans and of their religious worship. And though Mr. Selden hath reduced all the Asiatic gods under the common name of Syrian, in his excellent treatise upon that subject, yet we shall take notice of such only as were proper to Assyria, conceiving the rest nothing pertinent to the Chaldaeans or Babylonians. The religious worship of the Chaldaeans may be reduced to three kinds: the first, a worship of the true God, but after an idolatrous manner; the second, of daemons or spirits; the third, of the celestial bodies and elements. Chapter 1, of their idolatrous worship of the true God. The first kind of the Chaldaic worship was of the true God, though after an idolatrous manner. The author of the Chaldaic summary affirms that they held one principle of all things, and declare that it is one and good. That by this one and good they meant the true God, may be gathered from a Eusebius, who saith, that in the first place they conceive God the Father and King ought to be ranked. For this reason the Delphian oracle attested by Porphyrius joins them with the Hebrews, Chaldaeans and Jews wise onely, worshipping purely a self-begotten God and King. But that this worship, though of the true God, was idolatrous, is beyond doubt, so as to them might be applied what St. Paul saith of the Romans: when they knew God they glorified him not as God, but changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man. The name and image whereby they represented the supreme God was that of Bel, as appears by the prohibition given by God himself not to call him so any more. Thou shalt call me no longer Baali. Bel with the Chaldaeans is the same as Baal with the Phoenicians, both derived from the Hebrew Baal. Lord, this Bel of the Babylonians is mentioned by the prophets Isaiah and Jeremy. They who first translated the Eastern learning into Greek, for the most part interpret this Bel by the word Zeus. So Herodotus, Diodorus, Hesychius and others. Berosus was priest of Belus, whom they interpret Jupiter, the reason of which seems to be, for that Bel was the chief god with the Chaldaeans, as Jupiter with the Grecians, who by that name meant the true God, as the Chaldaeans by the other, for to him St. Paul applies that hemistich of Aratus, tau gamar ho exi gamanu omikronupsilons is sigma moenu, which hath reference to the first verse, ekapa dios arhokiomu epsilon theta alpha. And Acts 17:28, upon these words of St. Peter, worship ye God, but not as the Grecians. Clemens Alexandrinus observes, that he saith not, worship not the God whom the Grecians, but as the Grecians. He changed the manner of the worship, but preached not another God. The temple of this Jupiter Belus at Babylon is exactly described by Herodotus, an eyewitness, in whose time it was yet extant, thus: the gates were of brass, the temple itself square, every side 2 furlongs broad. In the midst of the temple there was a solid tower of the thickness and height of a stadium, upon which there was set another, and another upon that, and so on to 8. On the outside of these were stairs by which to go up to every one of them. In the midst of the stairs were seats for such as went up to rest themselves. In the highest tower there was another temple, and in it a bed sumptuously furnished, and a table of gold. But neither in this was there any statue, nor doth any person lie here a nights except one woman, a foreigner, of whom the God makes choice above all other, as the Chaldaeans who are priests of this god of error, for they say that the God himself comes into this temple, and rests in this bed. There is moreover in this temple another lower chapel, in which there is a great statue of Jupiter all of gold, sitting, and beside it a table and bench all of gold also, insomuch that the Chaldaeans value it at 800 talents. Likewise without the chapel there is an altar of gold, and another altar very great, upon which are sacrificed sheep of full growth, for upon that of gold it is not lawful to sacrifice any but sucklings. On this greater altar the Chaldaeans burn yearly frankincense to the value of 100,000 talents, in sacrifice to their gods. There was also at the same time in this temple a statue 12 cubits high, of massy gold, which I saw not, but take upon the report of the Chaldaeans. This statue Darius son of Hystaspes had a great mind to take, but durst not. But his son Xerxes afterwards took it, and slew the priest who forbade him to stir it. Thus was this temple built and beautified, besides infinite gifts and presents. Hitherto Herodotus, he terms the priests of Belus Chaldaeans, and Rabbi Maimonides asserts the Chaldaean idolaters to be the same with the prophets of Baal. The festival of Bel is mentioned 2 Kings 10:20, his oracle by Arian, the same which Stephanus means, saying, the Chaldaeans had an oracle which was no less in esteem with them than that at Delphi was with the Grecians. Chapter 2. Worship of other gods, angels and daemons. The second kind of their religious worship was that of other gods, angels and daemons. Next the supreme God there followeth a multitude of other gods, angels and daemons. These gods they distinguished into several orders: intelligibles, intelligibles and intellectuals, intellectuals, fountains, principles, unzoned gods, zoned gods, angels and daemons. To the worship of these belongs what we have already delivered concerning their theurgy. Chapter 3. The Chaldean worship of the celestial bodies. The third kind of idolatrous worship used by the Chaldaeans and Babylonians was of the celestial bodies, into which, Maimonides saith, they fell soon after the flood, perhaps occasioned by their continual addiction to contemplation of them, and grounded upon observation of the great benefits communicated to mankind by their influence. The Levitical law, in prohibiting this idolatry, sets down the particulars of itb, lest thou lift up thine eyes unto heaven, and when thou seest the sun, and the moon, and the stars, even all the host of heaven, shouldst be driven to worship them and serve them. And of the Jewish idolaters put down by Josiah, and to all the host of heaven. This doubtless they learned of their neighbors the Assyrians, of whom the prophet Ezekiel complains that they doted. Chapter 4. The sun. The sun and moon are first named and distinguished from the rest. With them perhaps this kind of idolatry began, before it came to be applied to any of the other stars, for in the most antient mention of it, we find these two only named. That the Chaldaeans esteemed these the principle is confirmed by Rabbi Maimonides, who saith, they held the rest of the 7 planets to be gods, but the 2 luminaries the greatest be. But of these they held the sun to be the greatest god. See what he further relates in confirmation hereof, out of the books of the Sabaeans concerning Abraham and the like, was delivered formerly. Of the Assyrian idols dedicated to the sun, Macrobius mentions 3, Adad, Adonis, and Jupiter Heliopolitanes. Adad signifieth 1, this god they adore as the most powerful, but they join with him a goddess named Atargatis, ascribing to these two an absolute power over all things. By these they mean the sun and the earth, that hereby they understand the sun is manifest, for the image of Adad is very fair, and hath beams bending downwards, to shew that the power of heaven consists in the beams of the sun, sent down upon the earth. The image of Atargates hath beams erected, to shew that the earth produceth all things by the power of the beams sent from above. Thus Macrobius, but whereas he saith that Adad signifieth 1, either he himself is mistaken, or his text depraved, for with the Syrians and Chaldeans or Assyrians Chad, HD, from the Hebrew Ahad, signifieth 1. But Adad or Adad which in the scripture is Hadad is of a different spelling. Drusius reads Halda, which signifieth 1 in Syriac. Of this idol perhaps is the prophet Isaiah to be understood, they that sanctify and purify themselves after one in the midst of the gardens, dedicated to that idol behind the temple. Subintelligendum enim templum. P1 templum saith Joseph Scaliger. Adonis is derived from Adon, Lord. That Adonis is the sun is not doubted, upon view of the religion of the Assyrians, with whom Venus Archytas and Adonis were held in great veneration. For the naturalists worship the superior hemisphere of the earth, in part whereof we dwell, by the name of Venus, the inferior they called Proserpina. Hereupon amongst the Assyrians or Phoenicians, the goddess is introduced morning, because the sun in performing his annual course passeth through the 12 signs of the inferior hemisphere, for of the signs of the zodiac 6 are esteemed superior, 6 inferior, and when he is in the inferior and consequently makes the days shorter, the goddess is believed to mourn, as if the sun were snatched away by death for a time, and detained by Proserpina the goddess of the inferior part, and of the Antipodes again. They conceive that Adonis is restored to Venus, when the sun surmounting the 6 stars of the inferior order begins to illuminate our hemisphere, and lengthen the light and days. From Saturnalia Part 1. Section 17. The last is Jupiter Heliopolites. The Assyrians under the name of Jupiter worship the sun with extraordinary ceremonies. The image of this god was taken from a town in Egypt named Heliopolis also. At what time Schemus, perhaps the same as Senepos, reigned over the Egyptians, it was brought thither by Oppius ambassador of Delabois king of the Assyrians, and by the Egyptian priests, the chief of whom was Parmetis, and having been a long time kept by the Assyrians, was afterwards removed to Heliopolis, the reason of which, and why being carried out of Egypt it was brought back into the place where now it is, and where it is worshipped with rites that are more Assyrian than Egyptian, I forbear to relate, as being nothing pertinent to our purpose. That this Jupiter is the same with the sun, appears as well by their religious rites, as by the fashion of the image, for its being of gold and without a beard, is sufficient argument hereof. The right hand is lifted up holding a whip like a charioteer, the left holds a thunderbolt and some ears of corn, all which denote the consociate powers of Jupiter and the sun. Moreover, the religion of this temple is excellent for divination, which is ascribed to the power of Apollo, who is the same with the sun. Likewise the image of the Heliopolitan god is carried on a bier, as the images of the gods are carried. At the solemnity of the games of the Circensian gods, many nobles of that country follow, their heads shaved, they themselves pure by a long chastity. They are driven by divine inspiration, not as they will themselves, but whither the god carries them. This god they consult even absent, by sending table books sealed up, and he writes back in order to the questions inserted in them. Thus the Emperor Trajan being to go out of that country into Parthia with his army, at the request of his friends zealous in this religion, and who having had great experiments in this kind persuaded him, to inquire concerning the success of his expedition, proceeded with Roman prudence, lest there might be some deceit of man in it, and first sent the table books sealed up. Requiring an answer in writing, the god commanded paper to be brought, and ordered that it should be sent holding a whip like a charioteer. The left holds a thunderbolt and some ears of corn, all which denote the consociate powers of Jupiter and the sun. Moreover, the religion of this temple is excellent for divination, which is ascribed to the power of Apollo, who is the same with the sun. Likewise the image of the Heliopolitan god is carried on a bier, as the images of the gods are carried. At the solemnity of the games of the Circensian gods, many nobles of that country follow, their heads shaved, they themselves pure by a long chastity. They are driven by divine inspiration, not as they will themselves, but whither the god carries them. This god they consult even absent, by sending table books sealed up, and he writes back in order to the questions inserted in them. Thus the Emperor Trajan being to go out of that country into Parthia with his army, at the request of his friends zealous in this religion, and who having had great experiments in this kind, persuaded him, to inquire concerning the success of his expedition, proceeded with Roman prudence, lest there might be some deceit of man in it, and first sent the table books sealed up. Requiring an answer in writing, the god commanded paper to be brought, and ordered that it should be sent to him blank, to the astonishment of the priests. Trajan received it with admiration, for that he also had sent a blank table book to the god. Then he took another table book, and wrote in it this question: whether having finished this war, he should return to Rome. This he sealed up, the god commanded, a centurial vine, one of those gifts that were in the temple, to be brought and to be cut into 2 pieces, and wrapped up in a napkin, and sent. The event appeared manifest in the death of Trajan, his bones being brought back to Rome, for by the fragments, the kind of reliques by the token of the vine, the future chance was declared. Hitherto Macrobius. To these add Bel or Belus, a name though more peculiar to the supreme deity, yet common to many of the Chaldaean gods and amongst others to the sun, as Servius witnesseth. In Punic language God is named Baal, but amongst the Assyrians he is called Bel, and by a certain mystical reason, Saturn and the sun, in Aeneid. 1. Chapter 5. The Chaldaean worship of the moon. The moon was worshipped by the Chaldaeans under many names, all which are feminine, and the greater part answerable to those of the sun, which seems to confirm what R. Maimonides delivers of them, that they held the 7 planets to be gods and goddesses, male and female, married to one another. Now the Chaldeans amongst other names applied to the sun those of Jupiter and Adonis. In like manner did they give to the moon the correspondent attributes of Juno and Venus. To Juno belong Ada and Belta, for so interpreted by Hesychius, Ada, Juno, with the Babylonians, Belthes, Juno or Venus, both which are doubtless no other than the feminine names answerable to Adad and Bel, 2 names of the sun. That by Juno mythologists sometimes understand the moon, the learned Mr. Selden confirms by the old form of inculation which the Roman priests used at the nones of every month, dies tecinque, calo Juno novella. To this Juno perhaps may more properly be referred what Julius Firmicus applies to the air. The Assyrians ascribed the principality of the elements to the air, the image whereof they worshipped, styling it by the name of Juno or Venus the Virgin, whom the choirs of their priests worshipped with effeminate voices and gestures, their skin smoothed, and their habit after the fashion of women. Thus he, but that the Assyrians worshipped the element of air is not elsewhere easily found. What he adds concerning their immodest rites seems rather of affinity with those of Venus, as described by other authors. To Venus belong the names Mylitta and Alalat. They learnt of the Assyrians and Arabians to sacrifice to Urania. The Assyrians call Venus Mylitta, the Arabians Alalat. Thus Herodotus, who indeed seems to make this Mylitta distinct from the moon, but that by Alalat was meant no other, is evident from its etymology from Lael. The Antiquity, amongst many other false gods, served one whom they called Alilath, and affirmed that she is the moon, as being the mistress and queen of the night. Chapter 6. The Chaldaean worship of the planets. The rest of the 7 planets they held to be gods also. To Saturn, whom Diodorus Siculus affirms they held to be the chiefest of the 5, they gave the common name of Bel. Eusebius, in the 28th year of Thara, Belus the first king of the Assyrians did, whom the Assyrians styled a god, others call him Saturn, and Servius. Cited elsewhere, in the Punic language God is named Baal, but amongst the Assyrians he is called Bel, and by a certain mystical reason, Saturn and the sun. Whence Theophilus Patriarch of Antioch, some worship Saturn as a god, and call him Bel, and Baal. This is done chiefly by those who dwell in the eastern climates, not knowing who Saturn is, and who Belus. Some conceive that the more particular name of this planet was Cune or Remphan, of which the prophet Amos. But ye have borne the tabernacle of your Moloch, and Cune your images, the stars of your God which ye made to yourselves. Which text St. Stephen renders thus, Yea, ye took up the tabernacle of your God Remphan, figures which ye made, to worship them. What is in the Hebrew Cune, the Greek renders Remphan. By Cune Aben Ezra understands the planet Saturn, whom Plautus also, as Petatus observes, calls Cune. Rephan is used in the Coptic language for the same planet. Of Jupiter there is little more to be said. Mars was first owned as a deity by the Assyrians. The Assyrians say he was the first who did erect a column to Mars, and adored him as a god. They gave him the common name of Belus, whence the Babylonian Belus is by Hesychius interpreted Zeus Inualios, Jupiter Martius. But a more particular name of Mars was that of Azizus, under which he was worshipped together with Mercury in the temple of the sun at Edessa, a city of Mesopotamia. They who inhabit Edessa, a region of a long time sacred to the sun, placed together with him in the temple Monomus and Azizus, that by Monomus they understood Mercury, by Azizus Mars, and that both these were assessors to the sun. Julian acknowledgeth to have learned of his master Iamblichus. Some there are who refer the idol Nergal to this planet, for the rabbis fancy this idol to have been in the form of a cock, now the cock being sacred to Mars and styled his bird, in regard of its courage. Hence they infer that Mars was represented under that form, as Venus under that of the hen by the idol Succoth-Benoth. Athanasius Kircher. Venus was worshipped by the Assyrians and Chaldaeans under many names, 3 of which we find in Hesychius, the first Beltis, which he interprets Juno and Venus. This was a name common to the moon also, and spoken of formerly. The next, Delphta, a name more appropriate to Venus than the former, as appears by its etymology, from the Syriac word Delphicoitian. The last Myleta, as Hesychius reads, who adds, the Assyrians Urania. Herodotus writes it Myleta. They learned from the Assyrians and Arabians to sacrifice to Urania. The Assyrians call Venus Myleta, the Arabians Alalat. Of which 2 names, though Alalat was given to the moon also, yet that of Myleta seems peculiar to Venus, it being no other than the plain Syriac word Malidba, generative or prolific, Venus generatrix. With this etymology well suit the rites belonging to the idol, of which thus Herodotus, in Herodotus, Historiae, Book 1, it states the Babylonians have one abominable law. Every woman of that country must once in her life sit in the temple of Venus, and there accompany with a stranger. Some of the richer sort not deigning to associate themselves with the rest of ordinary quality, are carried thither in covered chariots, and stand before the temple, a long train of attendants coming after them. The greater part do in this manner. There are many women sitting in the temple of Venus, crowned with garlands of flowers, some coming, others going. There are also several passages distinguished by chords, which guide the strangers to the women, of whom they make choice as they best like. No woman being once set there, returns home, until some stranger hath cast money in her lap, and taking her aside, lain with her. The stranger who offers this money must say, I invoke the goddess Myleta for thee. The Assyrians call Venus Myleta. The money she must not refuse whatever it be, for it is sacred, neither may the woman deny any man, but must follow him that first offers her money, without any choice on her part. As soon as she hath lain with him, and performed the rites of the goddess, she returns home, nor from thenceforward can be allured by any price whatsoever. Such as are handsome are the soonest dismissed, but the deformed are forced to stay longer before they can satisfy the law. Sometimes it happens that they attend a whole year, or 2 or 3 in expectation. Hitherto Herodotus, of which custom some interpret the words of the prophet Baruch concerning the Chaldean women. The women sit in the ways girded with rushes, and burn straw, and if one of them be drawn away and lie with such as come by, she casteth her neighbor in the teeth, because she was not so worthily reputed, nor her cord broken. To these adds Succoth-Benoth, an idol made by the men of Babylon, the signification of the word being the teats of the daughters. B. Some conceive that hereby were meant those tents or partitions by cords described by Herodotus, in which the women sate to perform the rites of Venus Mylitta, Venus being, as Mr. Selden is of opinion, derived from Benoth. But from the words of the sacred text, it is manifest that by Succoth, Benoth was meant rather an idol than temple or tents. The rabbis fancy it to have been in the form of a hen and chicken, for as they called a hen succus, that is covering, so they called hens Succoth, as brooding and covering, and Benoth they interpreted her chickens, which she used to cover with her wings. Whence Kircher expounds it of Venus Mylitta, chapter 7 of the other stars. Nor were the planets only, but the signs and all the rest of the stars esteemed gods by the Chaldaeans, for they burnt incense to the Mazaloth, and to all the rest of the host of heaven. Mazal is a star, they called the signs the 12 Mazaloth, the zodiac the circle Mazaloth, and sometimes, changing M into N Mazaroth, the Septuagint renders it Mazaroth, which Suidas interprets, the constellations called zodiac signs. This agrees with what Diodorus Siculus reports of the Chaldaeans, that they held the principal gods to be 12, to each of which they attributed a month, and one of the signs of the zodiac. B. That they worshipped the rest of the fixed stars as gods also, is implied by the sacred text last cited, which adds, and to all the host of heaven, and is more expressly asserted by Diodorus Siculus, who in his account of their doctrine affirms, that as they called the planets interpreters, so of the other stars, they called some the judges of all things, others conciliary gods, as we shall show more particularly, when we come to speak of their astrology. Neither is it to be doubted, but that as they owned some of the fixed stars by these common titles of dignity judges and counselors, so to the principal of them they attributed particular names and idols, as well as to the planets. And since the Chaldaic polytheism was not founded upon an imaginary mythology, but had reference to the celestial bodies, which they worshipped under several names and idols, it is no less probable than consonant to the Chaldaic doctrine that those other Assyrian idols, mentioned in the scripture, were of the same kind with the rest, and belonged to several others of the stars. But this conjecture is not easily evinced, in regard that there is little extent of those idols more than the bare mention of their names. Chapter 8 of Fire. There are those who reckon the elements amongst the gods which the Chaldaeans worshipped, that they had a particular devotion to the fire, is certain. By it, as some conceive, they represented the supreme God, as others, the sun, the ground of which analogy we delivered formerly. Concerning this pyrolatry of the Chaldaeans, there is a memorable passage related by Eusebius. Tintincha Chaldaeans, in the time of Constantine the Great, traveled all over the earth to show all men that their God excelled all other gods, for they destroyed all the statues of other gods by their fire. At length coming into Egypt, and making the challenge, the Egyptian priests brought forth a large statue of Nilus, filling it with store of water, and stopping up the holes it had with wax so artificially, that it kept in the water, but could not hold out against the fire. B. Suidas relates this somewhat differently, as performed by a priest of Canopus, who Canopus, taking off the head of an old statue, put it upon a water pot which he painted over, and set up in the room of Canopus. The Chaldaean began the contest with much rejoicing, and put fire round about the statue. The wax melted, the holes opened, the water gushing forth put out the fire, and the Chaldaeans were laughed at for their god. Chapter 9 of the Air and Earth. Of the air, thus Julius Firmicus, the Assyrians ascribed the principality of the elements to the air, the image whereof they worshipped, styling it by the name Venus the Virgin, whom the choirs of their priests worshipped with effeminate voices and gestures, their skins smoothed, and their habit after the fashion of women. As for the earth, Macrobius saith, thence they worshipped the superior hemisphere of it, in part whereof we dwell, by the name of Venus, the inferior hemisphere of the earth they called Proserpina. Ton B. More of this mythology, rather Phoenician than Assyrian, and perhaps more Grecian than either, see in Macrobius. Thus much concerning the doctrine of the Chaldaeans. The second book, of the Persians. Beyond Chaldea to the south on one hand lies Persia, on the other, Arabia. philosophy was communicated to both these countries by their neighbors the Chaldaeans. Zoroaster, saith Plutarch, instituted magi amongst the Chaldaeans, in imitation of whom the Persians had theirs also. Persia is the most considerable kingdom of Asia, bounded, on the north, by Media, on the east, by Cilicia, on the west, by Susiana, on the south, by part of the Persian Gulf. The first part, the Persian philosophers, their sects and institution. Section on, of the Persian philosophers. Chapter 1. Of the Persian Zoroaster, institutor of philosophy amongst the Persians. The Persian learning is generally acknowledged to have been instituted by Zaradusht or Zoroaster, but this name seems to have been commonly attributed to such persons as were eminently learned. Who therefore this Zoroaster was, or about what time he lived, is uncertain. Laertius styles him a Persian, Clemens Alexandrinus, a Mede, Suidas, a Perso-Mede, whence it may be argued that he was not of so great antiquity as most authors conceive. For we find the word Persian nowhere used before the prophet Ezekiel, neither did it come to be of any note, until the time of Cyrus. The later Persians, saith Agathias, affirm, he lived under Hystasps, but simply, without any addition, so as it is much to be doubted, nor can it be certainly known, whether this Hystasps were the father of Darius, or some other. Hystasps, the father of Darius, was contemporary with Cyrus, neither doth it appear, that the Persian Zoroaster lived much earlier. But at what time soever he lived, saith Agathias, he was the author and introducer of magical religion amongst the Persians, and changing their old form of sacred rites, he introduced several opinions. So likewise the Arabic historiographer, Zaradusht, not first instituted, but reformed the religion of the Persians and Magi, it being divided into many sects. Chapter 2 of Hystasps, a great improver of the Persian learning. The doctrine of the Persian Magi was much augmented by Hystasps. He was of Achaemenia, a region of Persia, son of Arsames or Arsaces. He lived in the time of Cyrus, whose dream concerning Darius, the eldest son of Hystasps, prognosticating his being king of Persia, together with the discourse betwixt Cyrus and Hystasps concerning it, is related by Herodotus. Darius, the son of this Hystasps, was born in the 4165th year of the Julian period, and was almost 20 years old a little before Cyrus died. About the same time also, Hystasps and Odysseus, joining together, conquered all Phrygia bordering upon the Hellespont, and taking the king thereof, brought him prisoner to Cyrus. Hystasps was a most wise person, who adds, that boldly penetrating into the inner parts of Upper India, he came to a woody desert, whose calm silence was possessed by those high wits the Brahmans. Of these he learnt the discordant concord of the motions of the stars and of heaven, and of pure rites of sacrifice, which, returning into Persia, he contributed as an addition and complement to magic. Chapter 3 of Ostanes, who first introduced the Persian learning into Greece. The Persian learning was first communicated to the Grecians by Ostanes. The first, saith he, that is said to have commented upon this art, is Ostanes, who accompanied Xerxes king of the Persians in the war which he made upon Greece. Xerxes set out from Susa upon this expedition in the beginning of the 4th year of the 74th Olympiad, though Diodorus Siculus, confounding the transactions of 2 years in one, relates it as done in the 1st year of the Olympiad following to be. Herodotus affirms that this provision was in making the 3 whole years before this year, but with a note premised in the precedent chapter, which cannot consist with the exact course of the times. For, saith he, from the subduing of Egypt he was full 4 years in gathering an army, and in making his preparations, and in the beginning of the 5th year, he began to march with a huge army, for indeed he set out from Susa, in the beginning of the 5th year, not from his subduing of Egypt, but from his coming to the crown. So that both Justine out of Trogus, and Orosius following him, do unadvisedly attribute 5 years, but most absurdly, doth Julianus, in his first oration of the praises of Constantine, say, that he was 10 years in making this preparation. But more ingenious than all these is Libanius, where he saith, that between Darius and Xerxes there was 10 years' time spent in making this preparation against Greece, since we have formerly showed out of Plato, that from the fight at Marathon to the fight of Salamis, which was fought in the 1st year of the 75th Olympiad, there were only 10 years run out. Hence it appears that Pythagoras and Plato, who were precedent in time to Ostanes, and in their travels conversed with the Persian Magi, were not fully acquainted with the depth of their sciences, or else being more reserved, forbore to communicate them, otherwise than as intermingled with those which they appropriated to themselves. Pliny adds, that Ostanes, whilst he accompanied Xerxes into Greece, scattered the seeds as it were of this portentous art, wherewith he infected the world, all the world whithersoever he went, and it is certain, that this Ostanes chiefly made the Grecians not desirous, but mad after his art. Thus Pliny, alluding to Goetic magic, of which the author of the treatise Perimagius asserts the Magi to have been wholly ignorant, and Arnobius affords him a better character, that he was chief of the Magi, both for eloquence and action, that he made address to the true God with due veneration, that he knew the angels did wait upon the true God, and the like. By Ostanes the Persian learning was brought into Greece, and therefore we shall not proceed further in our inquiry after the professors of it amongst the Persians. Sect. Second, the institution, and sects of the Persians. Chapter 1. The Persian Magi, their institution. All professors of learning amongst the Persians were termed Magi. Laertius, it is said, that philosophy and its original came from the barbarians, since among the Persians were Magi, amongst the Babylonians or Assyrians the Chaldaeans, and gymnosophists amongst the Indians. Amongst the Celts and Galatæ were those who were called the Druids, or Semnothi, as Aristotle, in his treatise Magicum, and Sotion, in the 23rd chapter of his Succession, affirms. Hence Suitus, Magi amongst the Persians, were philosophers and philothei. But their principal study and employment consisting in theology and religious rite, Magus is more frequently interpreted a priest. Amongst the Persians saith Porphyrius, those wise persons who were employed about the divinity, and served him, were called Magi. This is the signification of Magus in their dialect. And Apuleius, Magus in the Persian language signifieth the same as priest in ours. Hesychius, a worshipper of God and a theologist, and a priest, is by the Persians styled Magus. Some conceive they were so termed by Zoroaster, at their first institution. D. Suitus, Zoroaster the Perso-Mede, who first began the name of Magi to be celebrated amongst them. Others derive the word from Mog, a surname of Zoroaster, or Frome Mija Gush, one that hath short ears, affirming that Zoroaster was such. The author of the Arabic history relates, that the religion of the Persians being before Zoroaster's time divided into many sects, he reformed it. Agathias, that he changed their old form of sacred rites, and introduced many new opinions, and was the author and introducer of magical religion among the Persians. The Magi delivered their learning successively in their families from one age to another, whence after the succession of many ages, at this present, saith Ammianus Marcellinus, a multitude sprung from one and the same race, is dedicated to the rites and worship of the gods. For, increasing by degrees, they grew at last to the largeness and name of a complete nation dwelling in towns not fortified with any walls, and being permitted to use their own laws, they were honored in respect of their religion. The country of the Magi in Persia is mentioned by Clemens Alexandrinus, who takes notice of 3 wonderful mountains in it. Ansolinus mentions as belonging to them the city Pasargadae. Suidas and Cedrinus call them Magophony, and affirm that they were called Magi by those of their own country. So great was the esteem in which the Magi had among the Persians that P. Cicero saith, the kings of Persia, before they undertook the government, were always initiated in the sacred mysteries of the Magi, which Q. Plato describes thus: at 14 years old, they whom they call the royal pedagogues take charge of the youth. These are 4 men chosen out of the most excellent of the Persians in the prime of their age, the most wise, the most just, the most temperate, and the most valiant. The first of these teacheth him the magic of Zoroaster the son of Oromeses, and teacheth him also the royal institutions. Dion Chrysostom saith, that the Magi were admitted to the king's councils, and were assessors with him in judicature, as being well acquainted with the natures of things, and knowing after what manner the gods are to be served. All public affairs were managed by their direction and advice, they adjudged rewards or punishments. Dion elsewhere relates, that Cambyses, upon his expedition into Egypt, resigned the government of the Persians into the hands of the Magi. Constantius Manasses styles them the guardians of the royal palaces, and S. Pliny, speaking of magic, saith, it grew up at last to so great height, that even at this day it is exceedingly prevalent with many nations, and in the East it beareth sway over the King of Kings. King of Kings was the proper title of the Persian monarch. Chapter 2. The sects, discipline, and manners of the Magi. Eubulus, who wrote the history of Mystera in many volumes, affirms that amongst the Persians there were 3 kinds of Magi. The first, who were the most learned and eloquent of them, did eat no other food but meal and oil. Thus Eubulus cited by St. Hierome. More of the distinction of the Magi into three sects we meet not elsewhere, but probably it had reference to their several studies, of which hereafter. B. Dion and Aristotle, or rather the author of the treatise of magic cited by Laertius, relate of the Magi, that they renounce rich attire, and to wear gold. Their raiment is white upon occasion. Their beds, the ground, their food, nothing but herbs, cheese and bread. Instead of a staff they carry a cane, in the top whereof they put their cheese, which as occasion served they did eat. They had one in their society chief amongst them, called by Sosimene, the prince of the Magi. D. Their chief employment was religious worship, they being conceived to be the only persons whose prayers the gods would hear. E. They made discourses concerning justice, and esteemed it impious to burn the bodies of the dead, and lawful to lie with a mother or a daughter, as Solon in his 23rd book. Herodotus saith, they differ, as from others, so from the Egyptian priests in this, that these pollute themselves with the death of nothing but their sacrifices, whereas the Magi, with their own hands, kill anything, except a man and a dog, yea, they esteem it a great exploit, if they have killed every man-dragon, or serpent, or other creeping or flying thing. The second part, the doctrine of the Persians. That which is delivered to us of the Persian doctrine and opinions is so little and so imperfect as it will not easily admit of being knit together by any method, yet in regard of the near affinity their learning is conceived to have had with the Chaldaeans we shall observe the same course in collecting and digesting the few remains of it, first, to allege what concerns their theology and physic, next, their arts of divination, thirdly, their religious worship and rites, particularly termed magic, and lastly to give a catalogue of all their gods. Chapter 1, Theology and Physic. That the Persian Magi were not unacquainted with theology and physic is confirmed by Suidas. Magi, saith he, among the Persians are philosophers and lovers of God. B. Laertius affirms, they discoursed concerning the substance and generation of the gods, and Dion Chrysostom, that they were skillful in natures. Zoroaster the Magus, in his sacred collection of physics, saith expressly thus, God hath the head of a hawk. He is the first incorruptible, eternal, unbegotten, indivisible, most like himself, the charioteer of every good, one that cannot be bribed, the best of things good, the wisest of things wise. Moreover, he is the father of equity and justice, self-taught, natural and perfect and wise, and the sole inventor of sacred nature. Plutarch relates of Zoroaster, that he divided all things into three kinds. Over the first kind he conceived Horomazes to be president, the same whom the oracles call the father. Over the last, Arimanes, over the middle kind, Mithra, whom the oracles call the second mind. And that Horomazes made himself 3 times as big as the sun, Mithra made himself twice as big, who was next to Horomazes. To which these Platonic assertions are correspondent. That all things are about the king of all, and that all things are for him, that he is the cause of all good things. The second is employed about the secondary things. The third is employed about the third kind of things. The 3 parts into which Zoroaster and Plato divided all things are these. The first is eternal, the second had a beginning in time, but is eternal, the third is corruptible. Thus Plato, citing Plutarch, whose own words are these. Some are of opinion that there are 2 gods, one opposite in operation to the other, one working good, the other ill. Others call him, who is the good God, the bad daemon. Of this opinion was Zoroaster the Magus, whom they report to have preceded the Trojan War 5,000 years. This Zoroaster declared the names of the good to be Oromazes, of the bad, Arimanius, adding, that, of sensible things, the one did most resemble light and knowledge, the other darkness and ignorance. Wherefore the Persians call Mithra the mediator. He further taught that to one we ought to offer votives and gratulatory sacrifices, to the other, avaruncative and dismal oblations. 4. Pounding a certain herb called onomomi in a mortar. They invoke Hades and darkness, then mixing it with the blood of a slain wolf, they carry it forth and throw it into a place where the beams of the sun come not. 4. Of plants they hold, that some belong to the good god, others, to the ill daemon, and that of animals, some as dogs, birds and porcupines, belong to the good, the aquatile, to the bad, for which reason they esteem him blessed who hath killed most of that kind. G. They likewise relate many fabulous things concerning the gods, of which kind is this I will allege, that Oromazes was produced of purest light, Arimanius of darkness, and that these 2 war against one another, that Oromazes made 6 gods, the first of benevolence, the second of truth, the third of equity, the rest of wisdom, riches and pleasure, which good things are attendant upon the Maker, that then Horomazes tripled himself, and removed himself so far from the sun, as the sun is distant from the earth, and that they adorned the heaven with stars, appointed one the dog star as guardian and watch for the rest, that he made 24 other gods, and put them in an egg, and that Aramanius having made as many more, they broke the egg, whence it comes, that good is intermingled with ill. That the fatal time approacheth, in which these shall be destroyed by famine and pestilence, and Aramanius utterly destroyed, and the earth made even and smooth, there shall be one life and one city of all men living, and one language. Plutarch, Deicide et Osiride. Plutarch reports a Zoroastrian dualism, particularly the cosmological division between Oromazes and Aramanius, as well as ritual offerings, Mithra's mediating role, and symbolic classifications of plants and animals in Persian religious thought. Chapter 2. Arts of Divination. Amongst the other parts of the Persian learning are to be reckoned their arts of divination and prediction, which Laertius affirms were practiced by the Magi. B. Cicero adds, that they assembled in temples or consecrated places, to consult about divination. Hence Strabo saith, that, by the Antians, diviners were much esteemed, such as, amongst the Persians were the Magi, and necromancers, and lecanomancers, and hydromancers, D. Alien, that the wisdom of the Persian Magi, besides all other things which it was lawful for them to know, did consist also in divination. Andalusian styles the Magi a kind of persons skillful in divination, and dedicated to the gods. Of their divination Cicero giveth an instance concerning Cyrus, G. Alien, another concerning Ochus. Amongst other kinds of divination, H. Velleius Paterculus affirms that they foretold by the marks of the body. They seem to have been skillful likewise in astrology. Fori Suidas escribeth to the Persian Zoroaster 5 books of astroscopic apotelesms, that they were also consulted concerning the presignification of prodigies, is manifest from the relation of Valerius Maximus, concerning that which happened to Xerxes. Chapter 3 of the Religious Rites, or Magic of the Persians. The chief science and employment of the Persian Magi was termed magic, from the professors Magi, and is defined by Plato, one the service of the gods called also mastutike. The Magi, saith Laertius B., are employed in the service of the gods, and about sacrificing and praying, as being the only persons whom the gods will bear. So Dion Chrysostom, the Persians call them Magi, who are skillful in the worship of the gods, not like the Greeks who, ignorant of the meaning of the word, call them so, who were skillful in Goetic magic, of which that the Persian Magi were ignorant. Laertius allegeth the testimonies of Aristotle, in his treatise entitled Magic, and Dion, in the first book of his histories. As concerning their religious rites, Herodotus and Strabo affirm that they had no temples, altars, or images, but did impute it to madness in such as had, the reason whereof Herodotus conceives to have been, for that they did not believe as the Grecians, that the gods were of humane form, or as Cicero, for that they conceived the gods to whom the whole world was but a temple or house, could not be shut up within walls, upon which ground the Magi persuaded Xerxes to burn the Grecian temples. But Strabo frequently elsewhere mentions their temples, altars, and images, whence it may be argued, either that in the time of Herodotus they had not any, and that Strabo, in affirming the same. Herodotus and Strabo further add, that they sacrificed in high places. Their rites and sacrifices, Herodotus describes thus: when they go about to sacrifice, they neither erect an altar, nor kindle fire, nor use libation, nor flutes, nor garlands, nor cakes, but when any man intends to sacrifice to some one of these gods, he drives the victim to a clean place, and invokes that god, his tiara being crowned with myrtle. It is not lawful for him who sacrificeth to pray for good things for himself alone, but he must pray for all the Persians in general, and in particular for the king, for in praying for all the Persians he includes himself. Having cut the victim into little pieces, he boils the flesh, and strewing soft herbs, especially trefoil, he lays the flesh upon them. The Magus standing by sings a theogonial hymn, for this they conceive to be a powerful incantation. Without a Magus it is not lawful for them to sacrifice. Soon after, he who sacrificeth takes away the flesh, and disposeth of it as he pleaseth. Chapter 4. The gods of the Persians. Herodotus and Strabo reckon the gods of the Persians thus: Jupiter, the sun, the moon, Venus, the fire, the earth, the winds, the water. Laertius not so fully: the fire, the earth, and the water. By Jupiter, as Herodotus and Strabo affirm, they understood the whole circuit of heaven. Agathias adds, that they worship Jupiter under the name of Bel, which sufficiently argues they derived this god from the Chaldaeans. To the sun they sacrificed, Strabo adds, that they called him Mithra. This was the greatest of their gods, as Cyrus acknowledgeth, swearing by him. Hesychius likewise affirms it was the greatest of their gods, and that the greatest oath which the king himself took was by Mithra. They yet presented him with the face of a lion, in a Persian habit, with a tiara, holding with both hands a bull by the horns, which seemed to strive to get from him, signifying that the moon begins to receive her light from him when she leaves him. F. Zoroaster. First amongst the Persians did consecrate a natural cave in the mountains next Persia, in honor of Mithra, the nymph, king and father of all, signifying by this cave the world framed by Mithra, by the other things disposed within it, in fit distances, the elements and quarters of the world. The cave of Mithra is mentioned by many others. In the Mithrian rites, Celsus saith, the twofold motion of the stars, fixed and erratic, was represented, and the passage of the soul through them, in sign whereof there was set up a high pair of stairs, having 7 gates, the first of lead, the second of tin, the third of brass, the fourth of iron, the fifth of leather, the 6th of silver, the 7th of gold. The first belongs to Saturn, the lead signifying the slowness of that planet, the second to Venus, to whom they compare tin for its brightness, and softness, the third to Jupiter, as being most solid with brazen steps, the fourth to Mercury, for they hold him to be the stoutest undertaker of all business, cunning and eloquent, the fifth to Mars in regard of its unequal and various commixture, the 6th to the moon, of silver, the 7th to the sun, whose color as also that of the stars resembles gold. He who was initiated into these rites proceeded, as Suidas relates, through several degrees of contumely, and of pain, as burning, blows, and the like, by which trial he was to give testimony of his sanctity, and of his being void of passion. Of the rites of the moon there is nothing said in particular. Concerning those of Venus, Herodotus saith, they sacrifice also to Urania, which they learnt of the Assyrians and Arabians. The Assyrians call Venus Mylitta, the Arabians Alalat, the Persians Mitra, and as Mylitta in Syriac signifieth generative, prolific, so Medea, or Mater, with the Persians, signifieth a mother. This perhaps was that mother of the gods, which M. Cicero affirms to have been worshipped by the Persian Syrians, and all the kings of Europe and Asia with great devotion. The fire, and Julius Firmicus saith, they preferred before all the other elements. O. Agathias affirms, they learnt to worship it of the Chaldaeans. P. Strabo relates, that in Cappadocia there was a great number of magi, called Pyrethri, and many temples of the Persian gods. They kill not the victim with a knife, but strike it down with a club. Here also there are Pyrothea, in the midst of which is an altar, covered with great store of ashes, where the magi preserve a fire that never goes out, and coming in every day sing almost the space of an hour, holding a bundle of rods before the fire. Their heads are covered with woolen tiaras, which being tied on both sides hide their lips and cheeks, thus Strabo, an eye-witness. These Pyrothea were those sempiternal fires of the Magi mentioned by R. Ammianus Marcellinus. Neither in temples only did they use these rites, but in private caves, where S. Julius Firmicus reports they worship the fire with many extraordinary ceremonies, as amongst other things using to pronounce these words, Muyota Pitau Alpha Beta Alpha, Muyota Sigma Sigma Alpha Omega, O Kappa Lambda Omicron Pietas, Sigma Epsilon Nu Delta Tau Epsilon P Alpha Tau Epsilon Omicrons, Alpha Chief Alpha Omicron. Nor did this worship extend to fire only, but to all things that resembled it, as Dionysius reports, where Strabo instanceth the Pyropus. Ex Julius Firmicus adds, that they called the fire Mithra, by which, as also by their worshipping it in caves, it is manifest that they took it for the sun, their greatest deity. Concerning the worship of the earth and winds nothing particular is delivered. That of the water was performed in this manner. They go to a lake, river, or spring, where they make a trench and kill a victim, taking care that none of the blood come at the water. Then laying myrtle and laurel upon it they burn it with rods, and making some prayers, sprinkle oil mixed with milk and honey, not in the fire or water, but on the earth. Other gods the Persians had, though not reckoned amongst these, whether as lesser principle, or of later date. Of those are mentioned by the same author, and by others, Anatis Amenditis, Sakia, Sandes and Nanika. Hitherto of the doctrine of the Persians, the third book, of the Sabaeans. Arabia, the noblest peninsula of Asia, is terminated by the Persian, the Indian, and the Red Sea, except that on one side it is conterminous to Syria, by which vicinity was occasioned so near a correspondence betwixt those nations, that as the Chaldean learning overspreading all Mesopotamia, Syria and Assyria did on one side extend to their neighbors the Persians, so on the other it reached to the Arabians. From which nearness perhaps it was that Pliny useth their names promiscuously, calling a great part of Mesopotamia Arabia, and the Arabians themselves Syrians. And the later Eastern writers under the appellation of Kasdim or Chaldanim comprehended not only the Babylonians, but the Nabateans, Turanians, and Sabaeans, as Muhammad Isfasides takes Kasdanin and Nabathea to be synonymous, and Ahmadus, to his book concerning the religion of the Sabaeans, gives this title, of the rites of the Turanian Chaldaeans, commonly known by the name of Sabaeans, he adds, commonly known by the name of Sabaeans, because the Sabaeans being the most considerable of these, they likewise under the appellation of Sabaeans included all the rest. Even the Chaldeans of Mesopotamia, using the terms of Chaldea and Sabea no less promiscuously than Pliny those of Arabia, Mesopotamia, and Syria, for which our Maimonides gives this reason, because the doctrine of the Chaldaeans extended thither, and that the religion of all these nations was the same. Now whereas Arabia is commonly distinguished into the stony, the desert, and the happy, we here mean not that part which is styled the desert, lying on the north of Sabea, and first planted by Ismael, whose posterity afterwards, having learned the language of the Sabaeans, were called Arabians also, or more properly, Hagarans, as descended from Hagar, and Arab Masti Araba, the made Arabians. But those other true Arabs, the inhabitants of the desert and the happy, whereof the former came from Nebaiothus, son of Ismael, and are by Pliny, Strabo and Ptolemy called Nabateans, as the country itself Nabatea, the later from Saba, son of Chus, the son of Cham, after whom styled Sabaeans and the native Arabians. The Turanians mentioned together with these were the inhabitants of Kara, a city of Arabia mentioned by Pomponius, Mela, whose inhabitants the Karaeans, Pliny placeth next the Sabaeans, distinct from Hara or Karai in Mesopotamia. The first part, the Sabaean philosophers, Chapter 1, of the institutors of the Sabaean sect. Concerning the first institutor of learning and religion amongst the Sabaeans, there is not any certain agreement of authors. Patricides, an Arabian writer, attributes this invention to a certain Persian named Zoroastes, contemporary with Terah father to Abraham. Zoroastes and Zoroaster are the same, whereby it appears that Patricides means one of those two Zoroasters, whereof one was the first author of sciences. Amongst the Chaldaeans the other introduced the same sciences amongst the Persians, and though he calls this Zoroastes a Persian, yet by the antiquity of the time in which he conceives him to have lived, it is probable he rather intended the Chaldean. Others are of opinion that Takhmarat king of Persia gave beginning to this religion, the same perhaps whom Elmacenus calls Tachurith. Others conceive that the religion of the Sabaeans was mastered by a certain king of the Persians whose name was Tachurith. Elmacenus mentions another Persian to whom the same invention was attributed. In those days, saith he, came forth Nazareth a Persian who, as is reported, was author of the religion of the Sabaeans. Others derive the infancy of the Sabaeans from a certain Grecian named Juvan or Javan, son of Berkeley, and him they will have to be of the city Zaituna, which was built in Attica. Thus he, where Hottinger for Berkeley reads Merculum, Mercury, confirmed by Elmacinus upon the same subject. Others affirm that the religion of the Sabaeans was brought forth by a man whose name was Juvan, son of Marcoli, a Grecian who first found out the science of the stars. To these Patricides adds the opinions of some others, who held that the authors of this sect were some of those who were at the building of the Tower of Babel. Thus the Arabians. Some attribute the institution of the Sabaeans to Cham, son of Noah, who being banished from his father's sight, fled thither, and settled in that part of the earth which is now called Arabia. This was the first nation that knew not God, because the principal founder thereof had not received the worship of God by tradition from his father, thus Lactantius, with whom many agree in attributing the original of idolatry to Cham, and to his son Chus, the first planter of Chaldea, from whose son Saba the Sabaeans were so named, and upon this ground, some have labored to prove Cham and Chus to be same with the first and second Zoroasters, of which formerly. Others ascribe the original of idolatry to Serug. Epiphanius, and the author of the Chronicon Alexandrinum, affirm that Hellenism began in the time of Serug. This Hellenism, some conceive the same with the Sabaean superstition, what the Greek fathers call Hellenism, the rabbins term Goth. The Arabians, Algehalaton, the time of ignorance and paganism. And though to determine anything of those early and obscure times be very difficult, yet we cannot doubt, but that the idolatrous worship of fire and of the sun was of great antiquity among them, since mentioned by the most Antian of authors, Job, who lived near them, as appears by the inroad which the Sabaeans made upon him. The Chaldaic Philosophy. Chapter 2. Others of the Sabaean sect. That Terah, father of Abraham, was bred up in this doctrine might be conjectured from Joshua 24.2, where he is reckoned among those that served strange gods. Philo terms him an astronomer, one of those that are versed in mathematics. Of Abraham son of Terah, B. Rabbi Maimonides expressly saith, "It is well known that our father Abraham was educated in the faith of the Zabians, who held there is no God but the stars. Indeed Berosus acknowledgeth he was skillful in the celestials, and Eupolemus, cited by Eusebius, ascribes to him the invention of astrology and Chaldaick. The Zabians themselves in their annals give this account of his departure out of Chaldea. D. Abraham, say they, being educated in it, but dissenting from the vulgar, and asserting that there was another creator besides the sun, they began thus and objected against him, and amongst other objections they alleged the evident and manifest operations of the sun in the world. But Abraham answered them, You are right, which sun is like the axe which is in the hand of him that striketh therewith. Then they recite some of the objections which he brought against them, and at last they say, that the king cast him in prison, but nevertheless he persisted in prison to oppugn them. Whereupon the king, fearing lest he might do some hurt to his kingdom, and seduce men from their religion, confiscated all his estate, and banished him to the utmost borders of the east. Thus the Zabians, from which relation Josephus differs not much, who saith, that Abraham first undertook to convince the received erroneous opinion of men, concerning the deity, and that he first taught and proved that there is but one God, but seeing the Chaldaeans and Mesopotamians began to mutiny against him for it, he thought it expedient to forsake the country. The rabbinical traditions are more particular herein. Rabbi Solomon Hierarchy reports from an ancient commentary, that Terah fell out with his son Abraham in the presence of Nimrod for breaking his idols, and that Abraham was thereupon cast into a fiery furnace. Moses Gerondensis confirms the same story, but Rabbi Claeus relates it otherwise. Abraham, saith he, met with a woman holding a dish in her hand, and the woman asking him whether he would offer anything to the gods, he took a staff, and broke the images which the woman had, and threw away the staff. His father coming thither at the same time, demanded what was the matter. Abraham answered, that she had asked him whether he would make an offering, and that upon his answering that he would first eat something, there arose a dispute betwixt them, but his father urged that the business was otherwise, and that he was heard to say many reproachful things of Nimrod. The controversy was brought before Nimrod the king of Babel. He commanded Abraham to worship the fire that was set before him. Abraham answered, If so, then adore you the water which quencheth fire. Nimrod said to him, Worship the water. Abraham answered, If so, worship the clouds which distill the water. Nimrod said, Then worship the clouds. Whereupon Abraham, If it be so, then the wind is to be worshipped which agitates and scatters the clouds. Again Nimrod, Worship the wind. But Abraham, If so, then is man much more to be worshipped who understands the wind. At length Nimrod growing angry, You talk, saith he idly, I worship none but the fire, into the midst of which I will cast thee. Let the God whom thou worshippest come and free thee by his right hand. Aaron stood by and talked. They asked of which opinion he was. He answered, If Abraham get the better, I will be for him, if Nimrod for Nimrod. After Abraham had gone into the fiery furnace and was freed, they said to Aaron, Of which side art thou? He said, Of Abraham's. Then they took him, and cast him into the fire, and all his bowels were burned, and he was taken out dead in the presence of his father. Thus Rabbi Chira, but Cedranus affirms, that Abraham throwing his father's idols into the fire, his brother Aaron endeavoring to rescue them, was burned. The Arabians who imitate the Jews in relations of this kind, and fancy superstructures of their own upon fables of the rabbis, give a further account of what happened unto Abraham after his departure from Nimrod, as appears by a fragment of a Mahometan writer, of which I shall cite only so much as most particularly concerns the Sabaeans. Edris, on whom be peace, was the first who, after Enoch, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, on whom peace, wrote with a pen. This thing afterwards Edris taught his sons, and said to them, O sons, know that you are Sabaeans, learn therefore to read books in your youth. Now Sabaeans are writers, of whom the High said, the Sabaeans and the Nazarenes. The author adds, that they ceased not to possess the books of Seth and Edris by hereditary right among themselves until the times of Noah, and of Abraham. After that the high God aided him against Nimrod, on whom be malediction. But in that day wherein Abraham went out of the land of Iraq, and would go into Syria, into the land of his forefathers, he went to the land of Charan and Gesphra, and there he found a people of the Chaldaeans who read old books, and believed such things as were contained in them. But Abraham said, O my God, I did not think that besides myself and those that are with me, there had been any of the faithful who believe thee to be one. And God breathed to Abraham this answer. O Abraham, the earth is never destitute, but that there are some in it that dispute for God. But God commanded him to call them to his religion, and he called them, but they would not, saying, How shall we believe thee when thou readest not a book? And God sent among them a forgetfulness of those things which they knew of sciences and books, for they conceived the books which they used to be from God, and some of them believed, others not. Afterwards the Sabaeans were divided, and some of them believed, viz., the Barameans, who did not separate themselves from Abraham of blessed memory, but the rest followed their own religion very eagerly, viz., those who are in the land of Charan, who went not with Abraham into Syria, and said, We follow the religion of Seth, Edris and Noah. Thus according to Kisaiah, the religion of the Sabaeans was the same with that of the Haraneans, or Mesopotamians. What he relates of Abraham's being sent to the Sabaeans is all borrowed from the rabbinical traditions, but that there were anciently learned persons in Arabia, skillful in natural philosophy, astronomy and other sciences, is manifest from testimonies far more authentic, as from the discourses betwixt Job and his friends of the Arabian philosophers is it understood, that Solomon's wisdom is said to have excelled the wisdom of all the sons of the East. Tacitus, describing Judea, the land and bounds to the east are terminated by Arabia, and that the Jews called Arabia the East country is evident from several places in Scripturia, as Genesis 10, 30 and 25, 6, 18, Job 1, 3, Judges 6, 3, 1, and c. Pliny also mentions the Magi of Arabia, Ptolemy, the Gulf of the Magi, in Arabia, and Porphyrius relates that Pythagoras went also to Arabia, and lived with the king there. Chapter 3. Their writings. The Sabaeans pretended to have had the books of Seth and Edris, and not only those, but some also written by Adam, for the same author continuing the story of Abraham's coming amongst the Sabaeans adds that afterwards Abraham opened the chest of Adam, and behold in it were the books of Adam, likewise the books of Seth and of Edris, as also the names of all the prophets that were to be sent after Abraham. But Abraham said, Happy indeed are the loins out of which all these prophets shall come, and God breathed to him, Thou, O Abraham, art the father of them all, and they thy children. And for this reason Abraham deserved to be called the father of the prophets, upon whom be peace. Of the same allay, Maimonides conceives the book of healings to have been, which was hid by Ezekiel. The same Maimonides cites many other books of the Sabaeans, translated into Arabic, of which the chiefest is entitled, Of the Agriculture of the Nabateans, translated by Aben Vachashija, full of idolatical extravagancies. It treats of the making of talismanias, of the descent of familiar spirits, of conjurations of demons, of devils, of such as dwell in deserts, many other things it contained very ridiculous, by which nevertheless they conceived that they could confute the manifest miracles. Another entitled, The Worship, or of the Worship of the Nabateans, out of which Maimonides cites a story concerning Abraham related formerly. The book Hystamchus, ascribed to Aristotle, but falsely the book Hatalem's of Talismanius, Buxtorphius renders it, of speaking images, the reason we have given formerly. The book of Haslarab, the book of the degrees of the celestial orbs, and the figures that are ascendant in every degree. Another book concerning Talismanius, which also is attributed to Aristotle. The book of Isaac the Zabian, wherein he argues in defense of the law of the Zabiars. A great book of the customs and particularities of the law of the Zabiars, as of their feasts, sacrifices, prayers, and other things concerning their belief. All these are books which treat of idolatrical things, and are translated into the Arabic tongue. Besides these there are many others. Hottingeri cites a treatise of Mahomet the Elder, son of Isaac, who is otherwise called Abulsfark, the son of Abi Yaqub. The second part, the doctrine of the Sabaeans. What is left to us of the doctrine of the Sabaeansa is delivered upon later authorities than those from which we have the Chaldaic Bub, and therefore, perhaps is but an account of what it was in later times, degenerated from their primitive doctrine which was immediately derived from the Chaldaic. Nor is it improbable but that this corruption might be somewhat aggravated by the eager opposition of the Talmudists, and some Arabic writers that follow them, from whose hands only we receive it. However, we conceive it necessary to be annexed to the former, of which, though depraved, it pretends at least to be the continued succession. Chapter 1. Of the gods and rights of the Sabaeans. Theosabaeans held that the stars are gods, but the sun the greatest god, for they plainly assert that the sun governs the superior and inferior worlds, and call him the great Lord, the Lord of good. What they relate concerning Abraham, refusing to worship the sun, is delivered elsewhere. What they further fable of the patriarchs, that Adam was a prophet of the moon and, by preaching, persuaded men to worship the moon and composed books of husbandry, that Noah was a husbandman likewise, but believed not in idols, for which they discommended him in all their writings, that Seth also dissented from Adam as to worshipping the moon, see delivered more fully by Maimonides. Their forms of worshipping these gods was twofold, daily and monthly. The daily is by said Vahed described thus: they make the first day sacred to the sun, the second to the moon, the third to Mars, the fourth to Mercury, the fifth to Jupiter, the sixth to Beltha Venus, the seventh to Saturn. The description of their monthly worship received from a manuscript of Mahomet ben Isaac, cited by Hottinger. They begin the year from the month Nisan, of which they keep holy the first, second, and third days, adoring and praying to their goddess Beltha. They go to her temples, sacrificing sacrifices and burning living creatures. On the sixth day of the same month they kill a bull to their goddess the moon, and towards the evening of the same day eat it. On the eighth day they keep fast, and likewise celebrate a feast in honor of the seven gods and of the daemons, offering a lamb to the god of the blind. On the 15th day is the festival of Samael, celebrated with many sacrifices, holocausts and offerings. On the 20th they visit a coenobium of the Horians, called Cadi, where they kill 3 oxen, one to Saturn, another to Mars, the blind god, the third to the moon. They kill likewise 9 lambs, 7 to their 7 gods, 1 to the god of the genii, and 1 to the god of the whores. They likewise burn many lambs and cocks. On the 2008 day they go into the temple which they have in the city Saba, at a certain gate of Sharon, called the gate Asera, and kill to Hermes their god a great bull, as also 7 lambs to their 7 gods, 1 to the god of the daemons, and to the god of the whores, eating and drinking. But they burnt nothing of any beast that day. The second month, which is Fiar, they begin also with sacrifices, celebrating the consecration of Samael, and feasting. The second day they keep in honor of Elin Salem, drinking and filling their hands with tamarisk and other fruits. The 23rd day of the third month they keep in honor of Samael, whom they affirm to be the god that maketh the arrows fly. The Kumar, or priest, makes an arrow take fire 12 times, by rubbing another stick against it. The last time he creeps upon the ground, and puts flax to it. If their flax kindle, they conceive their rites well accepted of the gods, otherwise not. The fourth month Thammuz had a peculiar solemnity about the middle of it, called the festival Alukal of the weeping women, the original of which is thus related by R. Maimonides. In the same book, saith he, they tell a story of a certain idolatrous pseudo-prophet named Thammuz, who calling upon the king to worship the 7 planets, and the 12 signs of the zodiac, and being by the king put to an ignominious death, the same night in which he was slain, all the images from all parts of the earth met in the palace which was erected at Babylon to the great golden image of the sun, suspended betwixt heaven and earth. There this image of the sun fell down prostrate in the midst, and bewailed Thammuz, and began to relate what had happened to him, whereupon the rest of the images fell a-weeping, and lamented all that night. But as soon as the morning appeared they all flew away and returned home to their several temples. Hence came the custom, that on the first day of the month Tammuz they weep, lament, and bewail Tammuz. This custom of women weeping for Tammuz is mentioned also by the prophet Ezekiel, as imitated by the Jews. The 27th day of this month they consecrate to Samael, and to other gods and daemons, sacrificing 9 lambs to Hanan. In the 5th month, which as the Syrians they call Ab, they press new wine to their gods, and give it several names. This they do the 8 first days. They likewise kill a new-born infant to their gods, which they beat all to pieces. Then they take the flesh and mix it with rye meal, saffron, ears of corn, mace, and little cakes like figs. They bake this in a new oven, and give it to the people of the congregation of Samael all the year long. No woman eats of this, nor servant, nor son of a bondwoman, nor nation that is possessed, or mad. The rites of the 6th month, named Elul, are thus described by the same author. 3 days they boil water to wash themselves, that they may perform the rites of Samael, who is the prince of the daemons and the greatest god. Into this water they cast some tamarisk, wax, olives, spice, and sea. And when it is hot, take it before sunrise and power it upon their bodies, as an amulet. The same day also they kill 8 lambs, 7 to their gods and 1 to the god Samael. They eat also in their congregations, and drink every man 7 cups of wine. The prince exacts of every one of them 2 drachmas to be paid into his exchequer. On the 26th day on the same month they go forth to a mountain, celebrating the rites of the sun, Saturn and Venus, burning 8 hen chickens, 8 cocks, and as many hens. He who made a prayer and request to fortune, takes an old cock, or a cock chicken, to the wings of which he ties 2 strings, and sets their ends on fire, and gives up the chickens to the goddess Fortune. If the chickens are quite consumed by the fire, his prayer is heard. But if the fire of those strings goes out before the chickens be quite burned, the Lord of Fortune accepts not his prayer, nor offerings nor sacrifices. On the 27th and 2008, they have their mysteries, sacrifices, offerings, and holocausts to Samael, to the daemons and geniuses, which compass them about, defend them, and bestow good fortune on them. The 7th month, which the Syrians and Sabaeans call the 1st Tishri, hath peculiar rites, thus described by the same author, about the middle of this month. They burn meat to the dead, in this manner. Every one buys of every sort of meat that is in the market, of all kind of flesh, fruits, green and dry. They likewise dress it several ways, all which they burn in the night time to the dead, and with it the thigh bone of a camel. They also pour mixed wine upon the fire, for the dead to drink. In the 8th month, which is called the later Tishri, they fast on the 21st day, and so on for 9 days, the last of which is the 29th. This day they do in honor of the Lord of Fortune's Unc. The 9th month, called the 1st Canaan, is chiefly sacred to Venus. On the 4th day they set up a tabernacle, which they call the bed of Beltha, adorning it with several leaves, fruits, roses, and seek. Before they offer their sacrifices of beasts and birds, they say, "Let these sacrifices be destined to our goddess Beltha." This they do for 7 days, all which time they burn many beasts to their gods and goddesses. On the 30th day of the same month, the priest sits in a high chair, to which he gets up by 9 steps, and, taking in his hand a stick of tamarisk, stretcheth it out to them all, and striketh every one of them with it 3 or 5 or 7 times. Afterwards he makes a discourse to them, wherein he declareth to the congregation their continuance, multitude, places, and excellency above all other nations. He likewise tells them the largeness of their empire, and the days of their reign, after which he comes down from the chair, and they eat of the things offered to the idols, and drink, and the prince exacts of every one of them this day 2 drachmas to the exchequer. The 10th month, called the other Canaan, seems particularly devoted to the moon, for on the 24th day thereof is the nativity of the Lord, that is, the moon, at what time they celebrate the rites of Samael, sacrificing and burning 80 living creatures, 4-footed beasts and fowl. They also eat and drink, and burn body, sticks or canes of palm slender at the bottom, to their gods and goddesses. In the 11th month, Sijabat, they fast 7 days together, beginning from the 9th day, upon which they proclaim a fast to the sun, who is the great Lord, the Lord of good. They eat not in all this time anything of milk, nor drink wine, nor pray during this month to any but Samael, the genii, and daemons. In the month Adar, which is the 12th and last, they fast also to the moon, especially on the 28th day. The president distributes a barley loaf to the congregation, in honor of Mars. The prince exacts of every one of them towards his exchequer 2 drachmas. Chapter 2. Other rites of the Sabaeans contrary to the Levitical law. Maimonides mentions several other rites of the Sabaeans, which were expressly repugnant to the Levitical law, adding that he was acquainted with the reasons and causes of many of the laws of Moses, by means of knowing the faith, rites and worship of the Sabaeans. The examples alleged by him and others are these. They offered leavened bread only, and, for their offerings, made choice of sweet things only, and anointed their sacrifices with honey, prohibited, Leviticus 2:11. They used on a certain day to feed on swine's flesh, prohibited, Leviticus 11:7. They held it unlawful to kill and feed on some beasts permitted to the Jews, as the ox, which Maimonides saith, they much honored for the great profit he brings by agriculture, and therefore held it unlawful to kill him, as also the sheep, neither of which they killed. Some of the Sabaeans worship devils, believing they had the shapes of goats, and therefore called them serim. On the contrary, the Levitical law prohibits to offer sacrifices to serim, unto goats, that is to say, devils appearing in the forms of goats. Leviticus 17:7. Though they did abominate blood, as a thing exceeding detestable, yet they did eat it, believing it to be the food of the daemons, and that he that did eat of it should become a brother or intimate acquaintance of the daemons, insomuch that they would come to him and tell him future events, prohibited. Leviticus 17:10-23. They worship the sun at his rising, for which reason, as our rabbins expressly teach in Gemara, saith Maimonides, Abraham our father designed the west for the place of the sanctum sanctorum when he worshipped in the mountain Moriah. Of this idolatry they interpret what the prophet Ezekiel 8:16 saith, of the men with their backs towards the temple of the Lord, and their faces towards the east, worshipping the sun towards the east. Mahumam ben Isaac relates, that they shaved themselves with razors, and branded themselves with fire. There were also married women amongst them, who shaved themselves in the same manner, forbidden. Leviticus 21:5. Cah had a custom of passing their children, as soon as they were born, through the fire which they worshipped, affirming that such children as were not so passed would die. This was also expressly forbidden by the Levitical law. Another most obscene custom they had of engrafting, described by D. Maimonides, to which he conceives the Levitical prohibition to allude. Others there are of the same kind cited by the same author, who concludes, that as concerning those particular laws, the reasons whereof are concealed, and the benefit unknown to me, it proceeds from hence, that the things which we hear are not such as those which we see and perceive with our eyes. For this cause, those things concerning the rites of the Sabaeans, which I have learnt by hearing and from their writings, are not so solid and certain, as with those who have seen them practiced, especially seeing that their opinions and sects perished 1,000 years since, and their names were abolished. With the Sabaeans, we conclude the Chaldaic philosophy, the Chaldaic oracles of Zoroaster and his followers, with the expositions of Pletho and Belus. Originally printed in London, for Thomas Dring, 1661, the Chaldaic oracles of Zoroaster and his followers. The most considerable remains of the Chaldaic philosophy are those oracles which go under the name of Zoroaster. Some indeed condemn them as supposititious, forged by some pseudo-Christian Greeka, but this seems less probable, in regard they lie dispersed amongst several authors, nor are they to be neglected, in that they have been held in great veneration by the Platonic philosophers. Which sufficiently also argues that they are none of the writings charged by Porphyrius upon the Gnostics as forged by them, under the name of Zoroaster, since those were by the Platonic philosophers rejected and demonstrated to be spurious and supposititious. Some argue that they are not Chaldaic because many times accommodated to the Greek style, but there are in them many so harsh and exotic expressions as discover them to be originally foreign, and where they agree in terms with that which is proper to the Greek philosophy, we may say, of them as Jamblichus upon another occasion, as they are published under the name of Zoroaster. So also they contain the doctrine of Zoroaster, though they frequently speak in the style of the Greeks, for they were translated out of Chaldean to Greek by persons skillful in the Greek philosophy. To persuade us that they are genuine, and not of Greekish invention, Emirangela professeth to Finis, that he had the Chaldee original in his possession. I was forcibly taken off from other things, and instigated to the Arabic and Chaldaic learning by certain books in both those languages, which came to my hands, not accidentally, but doubtless by the disposal of God in favor of my studies. Here the inscriptions, and you will believe it, the Chaldaic books, are the oracles of Aben Esra, Zoroaster and Melchior, Magi, in which those things which are faulty and defective in the Greek are read perfect and entire. There is also an exposition by the Chaldaean wise men upon these oracles, short and knotty but full of mysteries. There is also a book of the doctrines of the Chaldaic theology, and upon it a divine and copious discourse of the Persians, Grecians, and Chaldaeans. Thus Mirandula, after whose death these books were found by Ficinius, but so worn and illegible that nothing could be made out of them. Further, to confirm that these oracles were translated into Greek by persons skillful in the Greek philosophy, let us call to mind that Berosus introduced the writings of the Chaldaeans concerning astronomy and philosophy amongst the Grecians, and that Julian the Sun, a Chaldaean philosopher, wrote Thurgic oracles in verse, and other secrets of that science, and probably, if these were no part of that Chaldaic learning which Berosus first rendered in Greek, they yet might be some of the Thurgic oracles of Julian, for some of them are cited by Proclus as such. From the account which Mirandula gives of those in his possession, to which were added a comment, and a discourse of the doctrines of the Chaldaic theology, it might be conjectured that what is delivered to us by Pletho and Belus, who besides the oracles, give us a comment on them, together with a Chaldaic summary, was extracted out of that author which Mirangela describes to have been of the same kind and method, but much more perfect and copious. This title of oracles was perhaps not given to them only metaphorically to express the divine excellence of their doctrine, but as conceived indeed to have been delivered by the oracle itself, for Stephen Ash testifies that the Chaldaeans had an oracle which they held in no less veneration than the Greeks did theirs at Delphi. This opinion may be confirmed by the high testimonies which the Platonic philosophers give of them, calling them the Assyrian theology revealed by God, and the theology delivered by God. And Proclus elsewhere having cited as from the gods, one of these oracles which speaks of the ideas adds, that hereby the gods declared the subsistence of ideas, and acquiesceth as satisfied in that the gods themselves ratify the contemplations of Plato. Some of these oracles which escaped the injuries of time were first published by Ludovicus Tilletanus, anno 1563, at Paris, together with the commentaries of Gemistus Pletho, under the title of the Magical Oracles of the Magi descended from Zoroaster. The same were afterwards translated and put forth by Jacobus Martyrus, and lastly together with the comment of Belus also, by Johannes Opsipeus at Paris, 1607. These by Franciscus Patricius were enlarged with a plentiful addition out of Proclus, Hermias, Simplicius, Damascius, Synesius, Olympiodorus, Nicephorus, and Arnobius, increasing thank by his own account to 324, and reducing them for the better perspicuity to certain general heads, put them forth and translated them into Latin anno 1593. They were afterwards put forth in Latin by Otho Hernius, anno 1619, under the title of the Sincere Magical Oracles of Zoroaster, king of Bactria, and prince of the Magi, but Hernius under the pretence of putting them into good Latin, and polishing them with a rougher file, hath patched up and corrupted what Patricius delivered faithfully and sincerely, endeavoring to put these fragments into a continued discourse, which in themselves are nothing coherent but dispersed amongst several authors. Patricius indeed hath taken much learned pains in the collection of them, but with less regard to their measures and numbers, and sometimes of the words themselves, nor is there any certain means to redress this omission, by comparing them with the authors out of which he took them, since few of those are extant, neither doth he affix the names of the authors to the several fragments, except to some few at the beginning. However, we shall give them here according to his edition, that being the most perfect, together with such additions as we meet withal elsewhere, and some conjectures to supply the defect we mentioned. And whereas many of these oracles are so broken and obscure, that they may at first sight seem rather ridiculous than weighty, yet he who shall consider that as many of them as are explained by Pletho, Belus and others, would without those explications seem no less absurd than the rest, but being explained disclose the learning of the Chaldaeans in a profound and extraordinary manner, will easily believe all the rest to be of the same kind, and consequently ought no more to have been omitted than any of the rest,